Hey friends, around 70% of viewers who watch my videos haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing. It would truly mean a lot to me. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps the videos reach more people and really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much. Let me know in the comments which city or country are you watching from. I've always preferred camping alone, especially out west where the trails wind far from the beaten path and the crowds thin to almost nothing. It's the kind of solitude I crave. No noise except the wind through the trees, no bright city lights, just me and the wilderness. Over the years, I've gotten comfortable with the routine. Hiking, setting up camp before dark, making sure everything's secure, and then falling asleep to the sounds of the forest. Most nights blend together as peaceful and uneventful. But one trip, somewhere along the Pacific Crest Trail in eastern San Diego County, stayed with me more than any other. That night was different. It was the kind of night that sticks with you because it reminds you how careful you really need to be out there, how quickly things can shift. I'd been hiking that day, following the trail as it wound through the Cleveland National Forest. The air was dry but cool, the kind of weather that makes hiking comfortable but calls for layers once the sun drops. As I neared a small water source, just a little spring-fed pool beside the trail, I spotted two women filling their bottles. They looked like they'd been hiking for a while too, maybe in their late 20s or early 30s. I caught their eye and offered a quick nod. I made it a point to be friendly on the trail, especially when you're off the main routes. I let them know roughly where I planned to camp that night, just to keep things open. Not because I expected anything to happen, but because it feels right to share that kind of information with fellow hikers. If they needed help or felt unsafe, they'd know where to find me. They seemed grateful for that, even if we didn't say much more. They packed up and headed down the trail. I stayed by the water for a few minutes longer, refilling my own bottles and rinsing my face. The sun was dropping low now, casting long shadows through the pines and oaks. I started looking for a good spot to set up camp. Something off the trail but still accessible, flat enough for my tent, and far enough from other campers to enjoy some solitude. Not long after I found my spot, an older couple arrived nearby, setting up their own campsite maybe 100 yards away. They were polite, exchanging the usual greetings and good wishes, but we all kept to ourselves. That's typical on the trail. People share a moment or two, but then settle into their own routines. The forest feels like your own little world, and everyone respects that. That night, the stars were mostly hidden behind a thick layer of clouds and fog that had rolled in with the cooler mountain air. The forest was quiet, the usual night sounds muffled under the dense blanket of moisture. I zipped up my tent, made sure everything was secure, and settled in for the night. At about 3 a.m., something shattered the silence. Suddenly, piercing screams ripped through the dark. It was loud, angry, and scared. Definitely not a prank or someone messing around. The two women's voices echoed through the trees, followed by harsh curses and panicked shouting. My heart jumped out of my chest. The older couple near me stirred instantly, and I was on my feet within seconds, grabbing my flashlight. We all rushed toward the source of the noise, stumbling over roots and brush, guided only by the sounds and the faint glow of flashlights. The trail was almost impossible to follow in the fog. The clouds and thick mist blurred everything, turning trees into ghostly shapes and making the ground slippery. It was hard to keep balance and direction, but we pushed through, driven by the urgency of those screams. When we finally reached the other camp, the scene was unsettling. Both women looked shaken to the point of shock. Their tents were still standing, but one flap was torn, like someone had ripped it open. Their eyes were wide with fear, faces pale in the dim light. They didn't speak much, mostly just pointed toward the forest near their site. They told us later that they'd woken up to find a man standing over their tent. No words, no explanation, just a presence looming over them in the night. It wasn't a stranger from the trail or someone they recognized. The way they described it, he was watching them, and when they reacted, he disappeared back into the darkness. The older couple and I felt the weight of that. Out there, alone, vulnerable. It's a place where you think you can trust people because everyone shares a respect for the wilderness. But that night was a sharp reminder that not everyone respects those unspoken rules. Thankfully, because of the altitude and the nearby mountain town, we had cell signal. We called the park rangers and reported what happened. They came quickly and took statements, then helped the two women move their camp closer to ours. It wasn't ideal for them to lose their spot, but safety was more important than privacy or solitude. The rest of the night passed with a tight, watchful silence. None of us slept well, the memory of those screams and the image of that man lingering in the back of our minds. We kept our flashlights and phones close, double-checked our tent zippers, and tried to stay alert. By dawn, the fog had lifted, and the forest looked peaceful again, almost normal. But for me, the feeling of unease stayed. I packed up early that morning, more aware than ever that you can never be too careful in the wilderness. It's not just the weather or the terrain you have to watch. It's the people. That trip changed how I approached camping alone. I started making sure I camped closer to others when I could, keeping an extra eye on my surroundings, and never letting my guard down completely. The wilderness can be beautiful and quiet, but it can also be unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous in ways you never expect. Looking back, I'm grateful the women were okay and that we were nearby to help. Could have ended much worse. And I keep telling myself that even when I'm out there alone, I'm never truly alone. There's always something or someone watching. I've spent more time alone outdoors than most people I know. I've camped solo in national forests, state lands, sugarcane flats, and mangrove edges. I've done contract fieldwork in remote wild areas all across southern Florida, restoration surveys, vegetation plots, species tracking, culvert assessments, things that pin you in one place with your hands full and your eyes down. I've parked my truck and hiked miles with nothing but GPS points and a machete to guide me. I've seen all kinds of wildlife, gotten heat exhaustion deep in the backcountry, fallen waist deep into swamps, and even stepped on a rattlesnake once that somehow didn't bite. I take my precautions seriously. For work or camping, I set everything up like I'm being hunted. Not paranoid, just prepared. Machete stays on me. Same with my .38 revolver, tucked into a sticky holster in my sports bra. On one lanyard to my right, pepper spray. On my left, my knife. Around my neck, a scream alarm that yanks with a hard tug. My Garmin InReach Mini always rides with me, clipped to my belt or bag or hanging from a carabiner on my camp chair. It pings my location by satellite, and someone always knows my plan and my check-in schedule. I don't deviate. I keep my campsite tight and efficient. No mess, no clutter, just what I need. Everything but what I'm actively using stays packed, either in the vehicle or in my bag, ready to grab and go. I've always got slip-on shoes beside my sleeping bag, a bright Gator light next to me for blinding the hell out of whoever I need to, red headlamp strapped on so I can move without killing my night vision. One chair out and another, a big, obviously male-sized one, placed where it's clearly been sat in. Trip wire around my sight at ankle height. I've got my dash cam aimed inside the vehicle, and if I'm tent camping, I use a wireless one, battery packed and pointed at me. If anything happens, there's gonna be a record. You don't grow up female and learn to survive outside alone without treating every night like it might be your last. Anyway, the story. This happened last fall. Work was slow and the weather was finally cooling down after a long, brutal summer. October in South Florida doesn't mean leaves turning and crisp mornings. It means the nights drop into the 70s and mosquitoes get a little less aggressive. I had 3 days off and decided to do a little solo recon on a piece of management land north of Big Cypress. I'd worked some bordering areas before, but not this exact spot. It was accessible only by a mix of logging trails and sugar roads, so I took my truck, parked where the road ended, and hiked in a little ways on foot. No designated camping spots out there, just open land dotted with cabbage palms, oak hammocks, cypress knees, and thick tangles of Brazilian pepper and melaleuca. The first night was nothing unusual. I found a flat, dry spot near a shallow ditch about a mile from the truck. It had good visibility and just enough brush and trees to make me feel like I wasn't fully exposed. I set up my tent, got my perimeter wire strung up using fish line and a few key branches, and made a little fireless dinner on my camp stove. I spent the evening checking my map, eating, reading a dog-eared field manual, and swatting gnats. The moon was bright enough that I didn't even need my red lamp most of the night. I checked in on the Garmin, laid down, locked the tent, and slept with one hand curled around the machete handle. Second day, I spent mostly hiking transects. Just basic layout work, nothing sensitive or especially demanding, but it was hot and humid and the bugs were out in force. I was several miles from anyone, at least. It was a weekday and not the kind of place anyone stumbled into. You had to know where this land was. You had to work to get there. I got back to camp around 5 p.m., changed into dry clothes, and took a slow walk around the immediate area. Tracks in the sand were mostly old deer, raccoon, maybe a hog or two. A couple old tire ruts where someone had driven heavy equipment in months ago and left it to the grass. Nothing fresh. But when I got back to my tent, I noticed something that made the hair on my arms lift. My camp chair, the extra one, the big men's one I always set up just to throw off anyone who might be watching, had been moved. Not a lot, maybe 3 feet, but I hadn't touched it since setting it up, and I always place it in the same exact spot relative to mine. I sat frozen for a good minute just staring at it. Then I walked the perimeter again. No tripwire triggers, but I checked the monofilament line and found one tiny section on the west side that had been lifted and placed over a branch. Intact, just deliberately moved. That was enough for me to go into full mode. I turned on the Garmin and sent an updated location ping with a custom message. Minor site disturbance. Proceeding with caution. That would flag it to my backup as not an emergency, but still important. I didn't leave that night. That would have meant packing in fading daylight and exposing myself on the road. I've made that mistake once and won't make it again. Instead, I locked down, moved everything essential into the tent vestibule, set a second tripwire inside my main line, slept in my clothes, boots untied but on, gun between the pads under my right arm, alarm string wrapped twice around my wrist. It was maybe 2 a.m. when I heard it. Not movement, not footsteps, breathing. It wasn't animal breathing either. I've heard all kinds of animal noises. Deer, feral pigs, coyotes, gators, panthers in the distance. This wasn't that. This was shallow, slow, human breathing just a few feet outside my tent wall. Close, low to the ground, maybe crouching. It lasted for a long time. I didn't dare move, just kept my breathing slow and quiet and stared into the darkness of the tent. After what felt like 5 minutes, the breathing stopped. I heard a shift in weight. Leaves crunching slightly, someone shifting to stand, and then retreating footsteps, very faint, moving away toward the tree line. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed everything in silence. No breakfast, no breakdown rituals. Just everything into the pack. Tent stuffed down tight. I erased all evidence of my sight and moved. I didn't go back to the truck right away. Instead, I looped northeast about 3 miles to a backup location I had marked but never used. It was tighter and a little more exposed but had good tree cover and some natural barriers. Downed logs and thick palmetto walls on 3 sides. I got there just before noon, made camp again, set up all my defenses in double and stayed low. My plan was to rest up, stay hidden, and hike out the next morning before sunrise. But just after sunset, while I was sitting silently with my back to a tree and the gator light in hand, I saw movement to the south. Not animal movement, human, about 30 yards away, just on the other side of the palmettos. A flash of fabric, a slow movement, like someone trying to crouch walk around the natural barrier, thinking I wouldn't see them. But I saw. I didn't react, didn't shine my light, didn't stand up. I stayed put, breathing through my nose, hands relaxed. Waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Nothing. The woods got quiet again. I sat like that until well after midnight, then crawled into the tent and laid on my side with my boots on and my pack in the vestibule. At 3:17 a.m., my tripwire triggered. The little bell I'd clipped to it gave a sharp metallic rattle that cut through the silence like a blade. I yanked the scream alarm and kicked out of the tent in one motion, blinding light in one hand, gun in the other. I scanned wildly, light burning into the tree-line. Nothing, then something. A figure, male, maybe 30 feet away, partially turned, hand raised to block the beam. I shouted without speaking, full body scream, arms wide, light dead center on him, gun raised. He ran, turned and bolted into the scrub, crashing through palmettos, one arm still shielding his eyes. I held my ground, didn't chase, just stood and listened to his retreat. When it faded, I pulled out the Garmin and hit the SOS. I marked my coordinates and typed a custom message. Human threat, 2 separate sites, activated tripwire, request evacuation, armed. It took 2 hours for the closest responder to reach me, an off-duty wildlife officer who knew the area and got in on an ATV. He found me sitting in the middle of my cleared site, light on, armed, calm. I was calm. I'd already taken photos of the disturbed tripwire, boot prints outside the tent, a broken branch near where I'd seen the man. They never found him. He hadn't left a vehicle on the sugar road. No fresh tire tracks, no camps, no ID, just prints and the memory of his silhouette burned into my retinas. That night reminded me why I do what I do, why I prepare the way I do. I got out unharmed. I got out with a record. There's dashcam footage of me flying out of that site before dawn. There's Garmin logs of every message and move. There's a report filed and a name on the incident log, even if we don't know his. I still go out, still work alone, still camp, but I never assume distance means safety. I never assume wildland means My name's Emily. I'm 28 years old, 5'4", lean but not particularly strong, and I've always found peace in solitude, especially out in the woods. I started solo camping a few years ago, partly as an escape and partly to remind myself that I didn't need anyone to protect me. I'm not reckless. I don't take unnecessary chances. I always text my fiancé and dad before I lose service, and I stick to well-mapped terrain with backup plans layered on top of backup plans. My gear's always squared away. GPS, topo maps, first aid, my trusty bear spray, and my deterrence. A pair of taser knuckles I keep clipped to my hip belt and a long, intimidating Sikh-style blade my fiancé gifted me more for peace of mind than utility. I'd never used it, didn't really want to. The trail I picked this time was about 2.5 hours north of where I live, tucked into a stretch of lowland forest and hills. It was mid-May. Trees were thick with green but hadn't yet turned oppressive. Nights were still cool, low 50s. I picked a lesser-used trail that ran along a ridgeline overlooking a shallow valley with a few small rivers and an old logging road, now mostly a faded memory on satellite view. The first few miles in were uneventful. The climb was steady, but manageable. I passed 2 couples coming down with overnight packs. One nodded, the other smiled politely. Beyond that, nothing. By early afternoon, I'd found my spot, a flat shelf just below the crest of the ridge, maybe 80 feet above the valley floor. Clear line of sight to the slope below, nothing but thick woods behind me. I could hear the wind through the trees. Birds were active, and there was no sign of larger wildlife. No prints, no scat, just woods open and alive. I set up camp, tent staked in a tucked-away hollow behind a large boulder. Food hung well off to the side, downwind and 100 feet from my tent. I sat and ate a basic dinner, jerky, trail mix, some crackers and cheese. The light dropped behind the hills. I didn't light a fire. I rarely do when solo. Fires draw people, and people are what worry me most. I went to sleep before full dark. Zipped up, nestled into my bag, knife within reach, bear spray clipped to my ridgeline above my head, air horn beside the sleeping pad, taser knuckles by the entrance. I read a few pages of The Gift of Fear, fittingly. Then I slept. First, everything was fine. But around 1:30 or 2 a.m., I woke up. No sound. Just that odd full-body awareness that something had stirred. I stayed still, listened. The wind had stopped completely. No night birds, no leaves rustling, nothing. just absolute stillness. Then I heard the crunch. Not close, maybe 50, 60 feet downslope. One footstep, maybe two. Then silence again. I didn't move. My heart started its fast, thumping rhythm. Not panic yet, just high alert. I'd heard animals before. Deer move in small bursts like that. Raccoons too. But raccoons are noisy and careless. This was measured. One step, pause, another, pause again. It went on like that for maybe 5 minutes. Too long for a curious animal to remain that still between steps. Eventually, the footsteps stopped altogether, still downslope and off to the side. I stayed frozen in place, tried to calm my breath, slow my pulse. Told myself it was probably a lone hiker who got turned around. But no one hikes at night without lights. I saw none. Eventually, I must have dozed off again. Not deep sleep, just light, on-edge dozing, the kind that comes with your brain refusing to fully disengage. I woke again just before dawn. This time not to a sound, but to a feeling. I opened my eyes slowly. Everything was still dim. I heard birds again, faint and cautious. The forest was waking up, but so was something inside me. I stayed still and listened. After about 10 minutes, I unzipped the tent and peered out. There was nothing there. No sign of anyone. Nothing looked disturbed. I got up, stretched, walked the perimeter of my camp. I even went down the slope toward where I thought I'd heard the footsteps. I didn't see prints. Not clearly. The leaf litter was thick and the ground was dry. But I thought I saw a few spots where the leaves had been disturbed, not by animals rooting around, but by boots. I told myself it was probably my imagination, that maybe I shifted in my sleep and heard branches settling. I made breakfast, packed my gear, and decided to hike out and circle to a secondary trail that would loop me back around toward the main road. It would add another night to the trip, but I didn't like the idea of sleeping in the same place again. The ridge had gone sour in my mind. By noon, I was 5 or 6 miles into the loop, down into the valley, and starting to climb another series of hills that would eventually spit me out near the old logging road. I passed an old campsite, a circle of stones where someone had built a fire months ago. Nothing fresh. Still, I didn't feel good. That gut sense was back, not sharp, but persistent, like the steady pressure of a low-grade headache. I stopped for water around 2 p.m. beside a shallow stream. Sat on a log, took my boots off. That's when I noticed the first thing that didn't make sense. A cigarette butt, right next to the log, still fresh, not rained on, not sun-bleached, just sitting there. I don't smoke. I hadn't passed anyone since those couples the day before, and this wasn't a popular spot. I left it untouched and moved on. That night, I picked a spot deep off trail, where a cluster of boulders formed a partial ring. One entrance, tucked away, a good spot, not visible from the trail. I made no fire, ate cold food, hung my bag, got into the tent just as the light faded. But I didn't sleep, not well. The forest had that same stillness again. Every snap, every shift of wind made me twitch. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer. They came from the same direction as the trail. Same cadence. A few steps. Pause. A few more. Pause again. I lay still. Didn't reach for anything. Just listened. After a few minutes, it stopped again. I waited. 30 minutes. Then an hour. Nothing. Finally, I reached up and unclipped the bear spray. Slid the taser knuckles onto my hand. Quiet. Controlled. I didn't sleep again. At dawn, I packed faster than I ever have in my life. I skipped breakfast. Didn't even bother with the food bag. Left it hanging. I moved fast, quiet, and off-trail. I knew how to orient myself toward the old road without a path. I cut straight lines, kept elevation in mind, crossed a few creeks. Got wet. Didn't care. I didn't see anyone. Not that day. But I saw something else. Around noon, I came across another camp. This one fresh, still smoldering embers in the ring. No tent, just a rolled-up tarp behind a tree. Empty beer can, flattened. Half a protein bar on a rock. And a shoe print clear as day in the soft dirt near the fire. A men's hiking boot. Not mine. Not days old. New. I left immediately. I moved harder now, faster, toward where I knew the road cut across the next ridge. By 4 p.m., I found it nothing more than a weedy, rutted path barely used anymore. But I knew where it led. 2 more miles west, and it would hit the fire access gate where I'd parked. I made it back to my car by 6. Sun still up. The lot was empty, completely. I threw my pack in the trunk, locked the doors, and just sat there for a minute, breathing, trying to decide if I was paranoid or if something real had followed me. The thing is, I didn't see anyone. Not once. But I felt them. I heard them. I saw the signs. And whoever it was, if it was someone, they were deliberate, careful, patient. The scariest part wasn't that they were there. It was how close they got without ever letting me see them. I reported it to the ranger station the next day. Told them what I'd heard, what I found, and where. They took my statement seriously. Said they'd send someone to check the area. But it's remote. Hard to patrol. A week later, I got a call. They'd found the camp. Still signs of recent use. No ID, just trash. They couldn't tell if it belonged to a hunter, a squatter, or something else. But they logged it. I haven't solo camped since. Not because I don't want to, but because something about that trip shifted something in me. I still go out with friends, sometimes with my fiancé. But I don't sleep alone in the woods anymore. Not because I'm scared of the forest, but because I learned that not everything dangerous out there is wild. Sometimes it walks on 2 feet and leaves no trace. Just a cigarette, but a footprint and silence. Years ago, I decided to try solo backpacking for the first time. I had done day hikes before, nothing too crazy. Just a few trails here and there that looped back to the parking lot before the sun went down. But I had always liked the idea of going farther, getting away from everything. Away from the noise, away from people, away from any sign of roads or cars. Just me, my pack, and miles of quiet trail. The desert mountains out west had always pulled at me, and I figured there was no better way to start than just diving in. I read everything I could, planned out my gear, practiced setting up my tent in the backyard, packed dehydrated food, checked and rechecked water filter systems, all of it. I felt ready, nervous but ready. I drove hours out to a trailhead in a remote area. No towns nearby, barely any signs. I parked in a dusty lot that could barely fit 5 cars. Mine was the only one. It was still early morning when I started. Sun just beginning to light up the dry ridgelines and rocky paths. I had maybe 10 miles to hike to the site I had picked out on the map. It wasn't an official campsite, just a small flat area near a water hole in a box canyon. Looked like a good place to pitch my tent, and I figured with no one else around, I'd have it all to myself. The trail itself was narrow and barely maintained. It wound through dry washes and climbed up and down scrub-covered hills. Loose rocks underfoot made it slow going. I carried all the weight myself. Tent, sleeping bag, water, food, knife, everything. By the time I reached the spot, my legs were sore, and I was dripping with sweat. But I was proud of myself. First time out, and I made it to camp without turning back. That meant something to me. The place was as quiet as I hoped. No sign of anyone for miles. There was a small water hole tucked beneath a rock ledge, fed, I guessed, by underground seepage because there was no stream running into it. The water wasn't crystal clear, but it looked like it'd do once filtered. There were animal tracks in the dirt around it, mostly deer or maybe javelina. The land opened up just enough to give me space to pitch my tent under some shade. I set everything up carefully, took my time, made sure all the stakes were secure. The wind was calm, but I didn't want surprises. That night, the stars were so bright I didn't even need a headlamp to move around. I sat on a flat rock for a while after dinner, just listening. Desert silence is different from other places. It's not really silent, it hums. Insects, breeze through dry brush, distant creaks from the earth cooling down. But it feels still, like time moves slower out there. I went to bed early, exhausted from the hike. The air inside the tent felt warm but breathable. I had my knife right next to my sleeping pad, tucked in the side pouch of my pack, just in case. I always believed it was better to have it and not need it. I had no reason to be afraid, not really. I was miles from anyone. No car, no sign of life except me and the lizards skittering across the rocks. Still, I zipped up the tent carefully and double-checked the zipper. Sometime in the early morning, before the sun was up but after the sky had started to lighten, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't even sure what had pulled me out of sleep. Maybe a noise, maybe just the shift in light. But I lay there with my eyes open, trying to figure out what I had heard. Then I noticed it, footsteps, not animal ones. These were slow, heavy steps with weight behind them, crunching gravel 1 foot after another, just outside the tent. Then a pause, then again circling, like someone pacing or inspecting. The steps weren't in a hurry, and they weren't casual either. They had purpose. I froze. My heart started thumping hard in my chest. The tent was thin nylon, basically see-through in the early light if someone stood close enough. I didn't move, didn't even breathe deeply. Whoever it was, he didn't speak. No sound except the footsteps and these low, strange grunts every few seconds. Not words, not even clear animal sounds. Just low, uneven noises. Sometimes it was a throat-clearing type sound. Sometimes more like a wheeze. A few times, it sounded like someone trying to cough something up. I kept my eyes fixed on the roof of the tent, not daring to shift position. I knew where my knife was, but I also knew any rustling would give me away. I figured whoever this was had to know I was in there, but I didn't want to confirm it. I was praying he'd think the tent was empty, or maybe that it belonged to someone not worth the trouble. The steps moved away after a few minutes. I didn't get up. I just kept listening. I heard splashing. Not light, not like a deer stepping into a puddle. It was big, sloppy splashing, someone swimming or pretending to swim in that shallow water hole. The same grunting sounds kept going, louder now, mixed with occasional yells. It was hard to tell if it was anger or excitement. I couldn't even tell how many people it was, but it sounded like just one. One person making too much noise on purpose. Then silence again. For a long while, nothing. Maybe 10 minutes passed. Then I heard the footsteps again, coming closer. Same slow steps, same crunching gravel. Circling the tent again. Then standing still, for maybe 30 seconds. Then walking away. Not fast, just gone. I stayed inside that tent until the sun was fully up. I waited until shadows were short and I could see the world clearly. Even then, I unzipped it slowly, only partway. I looked around carefully before stepping out. There was no one, no sign of anything, but the water hole was murky, clearly disturbed. The rocks around it were wet and the sand had been churned up like someone had been stomping around in it. I didn't see footprints, not full ones. The ground was dry and rocky in most places, but a few spots had heel marks, big ones. No shoes, though. Whoever it was had been barefoot. That chilled me more than anything. That kind of person doesn't bring gear or food or maps. That kind of person doesn't care about heat stroke or rattlesnakes. That kind of person is trouble. I didn't pack up right away. I was still trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to seem scared and bolt the second the sun came up. But I also wasn't about to stay there another night. I filtered water from the hole, reluctantly because I had no choice, and topped off every bottle I had. Then I packed slowly, checking behind every rock and tree. Took maybe an hour and I never saw him again. But the whole hike back, every time I turned a corner on the trail, I expected to see him. Every time I crested a ridge, I scanned ahead for movement. I never stopped listening. I didn't take a break. I didn't eat. I just kept walking, legs burning, shoulders aching from the pack weight. When I finally reached the trailhead, I nearly cried when I saw my car. Still there, untouched. The lot was still empty. No other cars had come. That trip changed everything. I didn't quit backpacking, far from it. But I changed how I do it. I avoid people now. If I see another hiker on the trail, I wait until they're far gone before setting up camp. I go farther out than most people are willing to walk. I make sure I'm invisible from trails. I never camp near water holes unless I absolutely have to, and I always filter enough water to dry camp if I need to. Most of the trouble I've had since then has been with animals. Raccoons stealing food, snakes near the tent, coyotes yipping all night. That kind of stuff doesn't scare me, but that man, whoever he was, that stuck with me. I never reported it. I didn't know what I would say. No crime had happened, and it's not like I could describe him. I never even saw his face, but I think about him every time I zip up my tent. I think about those slow footsteps and those strange sounds. I think about him standing outside my thin nylon walls, not speaking, just watching, listening, waiting. I've told a few friends pieces of the story over the years, but I always leave most of it out. People like to think of the outdoors as either peaceful or wild. They don't like the idea that sometimes the real danger isn't bears or heat or cliffs. Sometimes it's just another person. One that doesn't belong out there any more than you do. One that you'll never forget, no matter how many miles you hike trying to put them behind you. And I'm still out there years later, still hiking, still setting up my tent in quiet places, still watching, still listening. But now I always have my knife in my hand when the sun comes up. I've been camping for over 10 years now. Backpacking, car camping, dispersed camping, even stealth camping once or twice when I was younger and didn't know any better. I've hiked desert trails, alpine ridges, dense forests, and dry riverbeds. I'm not the toughest guy alive, but I've always been confident. I stay in shape, I carry a knife, I know how to start a fire even in wet weather. I keep bear spray clipped to my pack strap. In the past few years, I started carrying a .38 revolver when I could. It stays in a lockbox in my car, unless I'm backpacking somewhere especially remote and isolated. I have a CCW in my state and took the time to train properly. It's not about being some tough guy or vigilante. It's just that over the years, I've started realizing something most new campers don't think about. Nature isn't what you have to worry about the most. It's people. People scare me more than any animal I've run into. This story happened last October. I had been planning a week-long solo backpacking trip through parts of Yosemite. I've done sections of it before, but this time I wanted to test myself, go a bit deeper, stay longer, see if I could handle the solitude. The idea wasn't to be reckless. I prepped for months. I read up on recent weather conditions, carried a Garmin InReach for emergency communication, had multiple water filters, food for 9 days just in case, and proper bear hang systems. I had cameras too, motion-triggered trail cameras. Not because I wanted to see animals. I mean, that was part of it, sure, but mostly I used them like a kind of early warning system. If someone came into my camp, I'd see them coming next time. Sounds paranoid, but I've had enough weird run-ins over the years that I don't think it's crazy anymore. I parked at a trailhead that sees a decent amount of use, but after the first day, I didn't see a single soul. My route took me deep into some less traveled backcountry. I followed Forest Service maps and GPS waypoints I had saved in advance. It was quiet, peaceful. I remember setting up camp that first night on the north slope of a shallow ridge. I found a soft pine-covered spot beneath a few trees, maybe 200 feet from a creek. I did everything right, hung my food 100 yards away, changed clothes before sleeping, put a bear line up with 50 feet of cord between two trees. Textbook safe. The second night, I started to feel something. It wasn't anything huge, just an itch in the back of my head, a kind of alertness that stuck with me even after the sun set and the fire was out. I laid in my sleeping bag, eyes open, just staring at the inside of the tent wall. I told myself it was just nerves. I was going deeper than usual and totally alone. I had no cell signal and only the emergency beacon to rely on if anything went really bad. By the third day, I wasn't so sure it was just nerves. I stopped for lunch near a meadow. As I sat on a flat rock and ate, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the trees maybe 150 yards across the field. Not an animal. Too tall. I stood up slowly, watching, but nothing moved again. Could have been a tree swaying or a trick of the light. The mind plays games when you're alone too long. That night, I made camp in a low grove. The air was colder and damp. I kept the fire small. I had a weird sense I shouldn't draw attention, even though I hadn't seen anyone in days. Before sleeping, I put out the fire fully, like I always do. Scattered the ashes, poured water, stirred and poured again until it was cold to the touch. I kept the gun under my sleeping pad inside a small pouch. Not paranoid, just prepared. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a snapping sound. At first, I thought it was an animal in the woods. Maybe a deer or bear, the kind of dry branch crack sound you hear all the time out there. But then it came again. A second crack, then a third, and then silence. I held still and listened. The forest was quiet. No wind, no insects even, just the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. After a minute, I carefully unzipped the sleeping bag, reached under the pad, and pulled out the revolver. I didn't move more than that. I stayed inside the tent, listening, waiting. The rest of the night passed without any more sounds. When dawn broke, I packed quickly. Something felt wrong. I moved camps that day, went further than I had planned, covered nearly 15 miles to put space between myself and whatever was bothering me. At one point, I checked one of the trail cams I had set up near my previous campsite. It was triggered twice, once by a deer at around 1 a.m. and once more at 3:13 a.m. The second clip showed something. Not someone, just something. It was the back of a person, barely visible in the edge of the frame, halfway obscured by a tree. The camera only caught them for maybe 3 seconds before they stepped out of the shot. They were wearing what looked like a dark hoodie, jeans, and something hanging from their side. Could have been a bag, could have been a knife, could have been anything. I stared at the grainy image for a long time. I hadn't seen or heard anyone out there. I never heard them approach, and they didn't use a flashlight. And why would someone be out there, walking past my camp in the middle of the night? I deleted the footage from the card and took the camera down. I camped near a steep hill that night, against a large granite outcrop. I figured if I had something solid at my back, I'd feel safer. I put my bear line up again, this time higher and further from camp. The air felt thick. I barely ate. I didn't start a fire. I used a red light to see as I unrolled my bag and climbed inside the tent. I woke up again, this time at 2:44 a.m. My watch had a backlight I tapped to check the time. I didn't hear anything at first, just the silence. Then the faint sound of breathing. It wasn't mine. I was holding mine. It was right outside the tent. A slow, steady inhale, then a pause, then exhale. The kind of breath someone makes when they're trying to stay quiet. I didn't move. My heart was going wild in my chest. I slid my hand to the revolver inside the pouch beside me and held it there. The breathing went on for maybe 10 seconds. Then it stopped. Then I heard movement. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone creeping away. I waited another 10 minutes before unzipping the tent just enough to peek outside. Nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light I packed up. Didn't even eat. Just shoved everything in my pack and started hiking. I didn't care about finishing the trip anymore. I just wanted out. I had 3 days left in my plan, but I decided to cut through and reach the nearest ranger station by afternoon if I pushed hard enough. I moved fast, barely stopping. My knees were sore and my shoulders ached, but I didn't care. By noon, I stopped to refill my water near a stream. As I knelt, I glanced downstream and saw footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They were newer, deeper. A pair of boot prints heading toward where I had come from. They were fresh, still wet on the edges. Whoever it was had followed me. Or maybe they were just ahead and turned back when I moved. Either way, it didn't sit right. I filled my bottles fast and kept walking. Around 4 p.m., I reached the edge of the main loop trail that would take me closer to the parking area and ranger outpost. I thought I was clear. I relaxed a little. I figured maybe I'd been paranoid. Maybe I imagined the breathing. Maybe the trail cam caught a random hiker just passing through. Maybe it wasn't what I thought it was. Then I saw the fire. It was small, low, and built in a ring of stones less than 150 feet from the trail junction. Freshly lit. I saw a tarp strung between trees and a dark pack resting against one of the trunks. No one was in sight. I crouched low behind some brush and watched. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then a man stepped into view. Late 30s or early 40s. wearing the same dark hoodie and jeans from the trail cam footage. He had a knife on his belt, not a tool, not a multi-tool, a large, fixed-blade knife in a sheath. He moved slowly, methodically, like someone who was comfortable out there. He stirred something in a pot over the fire and sat down with his back to the woods, my direction. I didn't make a sound. I just backed away slowly, took a long detour off trail, and moved around the ridge until I was a half-mile clear. I didn't stop moving until nearly sunset. That night, I camped in a ravine. No fire, no lights, just crawled into the bag and held the gun to my chest. I set up my last remaining camera on a tree facing down the slope. Triggered once around midnight. The next morning, I packed and kept hiking. I didn't even check the camera. It took me 6 hours to reach the ranger station. I looked like hell. The ranger asked if I was okay. I said yes. I didn't say much else. I reported the location of the man and gave a basic description. The ranger didn't seem surprised. He said they'd check it out. He wrote it down, but he didn't look shocked. I didn't stick around. I hiked back to my truck and drove straight home. Later, I checked the footage from the last camera. At 12:41 a.m., the camera recorded a figure stepping slowly down the ravine. Same hoodie, same jeans, same knife. He stood there for several minutes. I've been camping most of my adult life. Solo trips, group hikes, car camping, backpacking. I've done a bit of everything. Over time, you start to get used to the random weird stuff that comes with sleeping outside. Animals shuffling around at night, branches cracking, strange echoes in the dark, people getting too drunk and stumbling around in the woods, or even just being completely alone in the quiet and realizing how loud your own thoughts can get. After enough nights, that stuff starts to blend into the background. But every now and then, something happens that sticks with you. This story happened a couple of years ago at a place called Seneca Shadows Campground in West Virginia. I'd gone out for a 4-day trip in early September, looking to get away from work and enjoy some solo time in the woods. I'd been to Seneca Rocks before but never camped at the walk-in tent sites, so I thought I'd try something different this time. These walk-in spots were tucked back from the car area, down a gravel path that wound into the woods. You park, then carry your stuff in maybe 100 yards or so. The payoff is you get some peace and quiet, a view of the rocks if you're lucky, and you're a little removed from the more crowded car camping part of the grounds. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The weather was solid, mid-70s in the day, maybe high 40s at night. Enough of a chill in the evening that you needed a decent sleeping bag, but not too cold to be uncomfortable. The campground wasn't full, but it wasn't dead either. A couple walk-in spots were taken, scattered here and there, but you still had space between you and the next person. My site was just off the trail, maybe 30 feet into the woods, slightly elevated with a decent view of the rocks if you stood near the edge. Fire ring, picnic table, flat ground, couldn't ask for more. I got my tent set up and spent the rest of the afternoon just hiking around, stretching my legs after the drive, then cooking some basic dinner over the fire. As the sun dropped, that cool mountain air settled in. I had layered up, pulled my beanie down, and was just finishing my tea when I noticed someone coming up the trail toward my area. He had a scruffy beard, medium build, maybe late 30s or early 40s, wore cargo pants and a softshell jacket. He waved as he passed, and I nodded back. He had a thick coil of climbing rope slung over one shoulder and what looked like a pair of climbing shoes clipped to his pack. I figured he'd probably been on the wall that day. Seneca Rocks is a big draw for climbers. He didn't stop to chat or anything, just went on to the next site up the trail and disappeared into the trees. That night was uneventful, cold enough that I bundled tight in my bag, but quiet and still. I woke up at one point when something small was moving near the tent, probably a raccoon or squirrel, but it didn't last long. I drifted back to sleep without any problem. The next morning, I boiled up some coffee and oatmeal and sat at the picnic table, looking through a little trail guidebook. I saw the same guy from the day before walk past again, heading out. He gave another wave, and this time I nodded back and said a quick morning, though I didn't get a reply. Again, no big deal. Some people are just more to themselves, especially out in nature. I didn't think much of it. I spent that day hiking along the North Fork Trail, which loops around and offers some beautiful views of the valley. I was gone for most of the afternoon, maybe 4 or 5 hours. When I got back, I saw the guy was still in the same site, his gear spread out neatly on a tarp. His hammock was rigged up between 2 trees with a tarp over it. Looked like one of those heavy-duty setups that you can sleep in all year if you know what you're doing. There was a small climbing harness hung from a branch, and a little camp stove sitting on a rock near his fire ring. I gave another small wave as I passed, and he looked up and gave this tight, almost mechanical smile. No words again, just that forced little grin like he was trying to remember how social interaction worked. It was the kind of look that makes you second-guess things, like, is he just shy? Or is there something else going on? Anyway, that night started normal again. I made dinner, read a little by lantern light, then got into my tent and zipped up around 10:30. I was dead tired from the hike and fell asleep fast. I don't know what time it was when I first woke up, but it was deep night, still pitch black. The kind of quiet where your ears start hunting for sound and latch onto anything. I laid there for a second trying to get my bearings when I heard it. It was a scream, not a sharp, high-pitched one, more like a growl turning into a yell, a deep, guttural sound full of tension, like someone getting injured or completely losing their mind. It was close, had to be within 100 feet of my tent, and loud enough that it cut straight through the trees and hit my gut like a punch. It went on for maybe 3 seconds, then stopped. Just silence after that. I laid there, frozen, trying to process what I just heard. I thought maybe someone was hurt. Maybe a bear or some other animal got into a site. But then, maybe 20 or 30 minutes later, it happened again. Another scream, same deep, angry tone. Not a panicked yell or a cry for help, but like someone was in the middle of a fight or completely snapping. It didn't sound like an animal either. It was human. That much I was sure of. I sat up in my tent and unzipped the inner mesh. The rainfly blocked most of my view, so I couldn't see anything outside. I listened hard, but everything was quiet again. I thought about grabbing my flashlight and stepping outside, but I hesitated. The screaming had come from the direction of that other guy's campsite, the climber in the hammock. He wasn't far, maybe 50 feet down the trail, and I started to think about how isolated we really were out here. The walk-in sites were quiet because people wanted space, but that also meant if something went wrong, you were kind of on your own. No ranger in earshot, no quick help. If I walked up on some guy having a mental breakdown in the dark, and he had a knife or a weapon on him, what was I going to do? So I stayed in the tent. About half an hour later, it happened again. Another scream, same as before. Then again. Every 20 to 30 minutes. All night long. Sometimes it sounded more like a shout. Other times more like a roar. But always angry. Always sudden. No words. Just raw, emotional noise tearing through the forest and making my stomach tie up in knots. At one point, I heard what I thought was the sound of something metal rattling, like a pot being kicked or a stove being knocked over. But then it went quiet again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just laid there listening, waiting for the next one. Each time it came, I flinched a little harder. By 3 or 4 a.m., I had my boots on inside the tent, my flashlight clutched in one hand, just in case I needed to bolt. But the guy never came near my sight, never walked past, just stayed in his area, screaming off and on like he was stuck in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. At one point, I started wondering if it was some kind of disorder, night terrors maybe, or PTSD. The idea made sense, but it didn't really make it easier to deal with. Because even if it was something medical, it was still unpredictable, still unnerving as hell. The sun finally started to rise a little before 6. I could hear birds chirping faintly, and the forest slowly started to come back to life. That deep black sky began to fade into gray, then blue. I got up quietly, packed my things in silence, and never even made breakfast. I didn't want to risk another minute there. I stuffed my gear into my pack, folded the tent, clipped everything down, and hiked out with a dry mouth and aching head. I passed the other guy's site as I left. I didn't stop. I didn't look too long, just enough to notice that the hammock was still there, hanging limp with a dark shape inside it. I kept walking. When I reached the parking area, there were a few more cars than before, a couple people milling around, just starting their mornings. It felt like stepping back into a different world. One where things made sense, where you could shrug off a bad night of sleep and move on. I got into my truck and sat there for a long moment before starting the engine. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, and I remember staring at the woods through the windshield, thinking how different they looked in daylight. Peaceful again. Familiar. But I knew I wasn't going back. I drove out of the campground and didn't stop until I was halfway home. To this day, I don't know what that guy's story was. Maybe he really did have some condition. Maybe he was just a messed up guy with too much anger inside. Or maybe something happened to him that I'll never understand. I never reported it. It didn't feel like something illegal had happened, just off, deeply off. All I know is that in all my years of camping, I've never had a night like that, and I've never felt that level of unease again, even in complete wilderness. It's strange how a single person, just one stranger, can shift the feeling of an entire forest. That night took something from me, not my love of camping, not even my trust in people, but it made me realize how thin the barrier is between calm and chaos. One person, one bad night, and the woods aren't peaceful anymore. They're just the background to something you wish you hadn't heard. It's been nearly 2 decades, but I still remember that night in Canyon de Chelly like it happened last week. The smell of desert air mixed with cottonwood trees, the soft rustling of campers packing up near dusk, the glow of lanterns flickering across tents, and the kind of deep silence that only settles in the high desert after nightfall, all of it still feels close. But most of all, I remember the dread. Not the kind of dread that hits like a hammer, but the slow-blooming type that curls in your gut and stretches, steady and hot, until you're sure it's going to break something inside of you. My now ex-partner and I had been road tripping for weeks across the Southwest, mostly camping in state parks and public lands. We were both school teachers back then, and summers were our only freedom. This trip was supposed to be about letting go, trading fluorescent lights and papers for stars and quiet. Canyon de Chelly was one of the last stops before we'd start heading back east. The campground was more crowded than most places we'd stayed. It wasn't a huge site, just a loop with maybe 24 camp spots tucked beneath tall cottonwood trees. The trees cast long shadows across the sandy ground, and the canyon walls that surrounded the area gave it this odd mix of intimacy and exposure. You felt small under the sky, but also like you were in a bowl on display. I remember we arrived around late afternoon, found a relatively flat patch near the back of the loop, and started setting up. Our tent was one of those ultralight models, the kind made for backpacking, with a mesh top and thin fabric that flaps like paper in the wind. It was designed to keep out bugs and rain, but not sound, and definitely not eyes. The top was so open you could lie back and see every single star, unless you had the fly on, but the night was dry and we didn't bother with it. I loved that feature usually, that feeling of being out in the open without being exposed to mosquitoes, but that night it made me feel like a fish in a bowl. We ate a quick dinner out of the cooler, some hummus, carrots, and the kind of sandwiches that fall apart the second you unwrap them. The other campers were still moving about, people laughing and chatting in low voices. There were kids somewhere down the loop riding bikes between the campsites, someone with a guitar a few sites away, and a group of older folks drinking from red cups a few spots over. Felt safe, familiar. No part of me was suspicious or on edge at that point. When the sky turned purple and the air dropped 20 degrees like it always does out there, we zipped into the tent and got ready for bed. I remember lying on my back, looking up at the stars through the mesh, watching satellites crawl slowly across the sky. My partner was already turned on his side, breathing heavy. I lay there a while longer, not really sleepy yet, just trying to absorb the silence. The wind had died down, and the campground had quieted, though you could still hear a murmur of voices from other tents. It must have been sometime after 10. That's when I first heard it. Footsteps, not loud, not stomping, but close. I figured it was a deer at first. It sounded soft, like something padding lightly on the dirt just a few feet away from our tent. We'd seen deer nearby earlier, so I didn't think much of it. Just stayed still and listened. The steps continued, slow and deliberate, moving from the side of the tent around toward the front. Then they stopped. I held my breath. A few seconds later, I heard something again. Only now it wasn't just footsteps. It was breathing, close. My heart started to race a little. Not full panic, just that first tightening that happens when something isn't right. I whispered, "Hey," not loud, just enough to stir him, but he didn't respond. The breathing was still there, steady and slow. I turned onto my side and looked toward the shape. That's when I saw the silhouette. Someone was standing right at the mesh wall of our tent, looking down, not moving, just standing. The moonlight was enough to make out the shape of a man. Not huge, not small, just average. But the stillness of him, the way he just stood there, not saying anything, not making a noise, that's what got me. I sat up quickly and said louder, "Hey!" That finally got a reaction. He turned and walked off, not running, not speaking, just walked away like nothing had happened. I yanked on my pants and jacket, heart hammering now. My partner rolled over, blinking at me. I told him someone had just been looking into the tent. He didn't seem too concerned, just kind of mumbled and said it was probably someone going to the bathroom or drunk or whatever. I stared at him, stunned at how he could be so dismissive. I wanted him to come with me, to at least acknowledge how weird that was, but he just rolled back over. So I walked out to the car by myself. It was maybe 30 or 40 feet from the tent, parked off to the side of the little pull-in. I climbed in and locked the doors, shivering even though it wasn't that cold. I sat there for a while, watching the road that curved through the campground, the bushes behind our tent, the outlines of the other tents lit faintly from inside. People were still awake in a few campsites. I could see lanterns glowing through nylon and hear faint music. I wondered if I was just being paranoid. Maybe it really was just some drunk guy who got disoriented. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then I saw him again, back behind our campsite, near the trees. Just a glimpse at first. A dark shape between the cottonwoods, almost like he was ducking behind them. I stared, eyes straining. He moved again, this time toward our tent. Not fast, steady, no flashlight, no stumbling, just a slow, confident walk. I sat frozen for a second, then threw open the door of the car and shouted. I didn't care who I woke up. I called for my partner, yelling that the guy was back. He sat up slowly, like it was just some dream I was disturbing. I told him we needed to leave, now, that I wasn't waiting for something worse to happen. He sighed, groaned, pulled on his clothes and walked over to the car. I didn't even want to pack anything. I told him I'd come back in the morning, but I wasn't staying the night. I was shaking now, not crying, just pure adrenaline. Like every cell in my body was trying to crawl out of my skin. We got in the car and started driving out of the campground. As we passed the loop, I saw another person walking along the road. A man, again. As we passed him, he stopped and turned, shining a flashlight directly into my face through the window. He held it there, just long enough to blind me for a second, then turned and kept walking like it was nothing. That was it for me. I told my partner to just drive. We left the campground and kept going until we found a Howard Johnson maybe half an hour away. It was late, midnight or later. We parked out front and tried calling the tribal police and park rangers from our cell. We explained what had happened, everything we saw, and they just didn't seem interested. Said there hadn't been any other reports. Said the park was safe. Nothing they could do, basically. I didn't want to go back to a hotel. I didn't want to sleep in a room with paper-thin walls and a window that locked with a rusted latch. We ended up pulling over on the side of a quiet road not far from Monument Valley. It was the only place that felt open enough to breathe. I reclined the seat and tried to sleep, the engine ticking as it cooled, my skin still crawling from the inside out. The next morning, when the sun came up, everything looked different. We were parked on a wide shoulder off the highway, just past a rise in the desert. To the east, the sun was creeping over the rocks, spilling golden light across the sand. And to the west, above the plateaus and jagged stone towers, the full moon still hung, pale and stubborn. I stepped out of the car and stood there for a long time, just looking at the place. It was beautiful in a way that makes your chest hurt, big and silent and old. like the earth didn't care at all what happened to you. We drove back to the campground later that morning. I didn't want to, but I needed to see it again in daylight to prove to myself it was just a place, not a nightmare. Our tent was still there, nothing touched. A few other campers were cooking breakfast, kids laughing and dogs sniffing the ground. I didn't see the man again. No one else seemed bothered. Maybe they hadn't noticed anything. Maybe it had just been me. But I know what I saw. We packed up quick and left. I didn't sleep in a tent for a long time after that trip. We finished the drive back east mostly staying in motels, places with locks and lights and walls. The next summer, I didn't go camping at all. I still love the desert. I still think about that sunrise. But I've never forgotten how fast the feeling of peace can turn into fear, how safety can be just a moment away from being shattered. That night wasn't a horror movie. No ghosts, no monsters. Just a man with no reason to be where he was, doing things no one could explain. And sometimes that's worse than anything you could make up. When I tell people about camping in the Smoky Mountains, I like to share the story of the Moon-Eyed People. It's something I bring up every time, almost like a ritual. I don't say it's true, but I tell it like it could be, and people eat it up. The story fits with my own family history, so it feels natural. I'm Melungeon, born and raised in East Tennessee, and those parts of Appalachia are where my roots dig deep, tangled up with all kinds of old stories and mysteries. The Moon-Eyed People are part of that lore, a lost tribe or maybe something older still, driven out by the Cherokee centuries ago. They say the Moon-Eyed had light-colored eyes, something rare in those hills, and it's a detail that always catches people's attention when I tell it. We Melungeons often have that same trait, so there's always been a running joke that maybe we're connected somehow, like the Moon-Eyed never really disappeared. The way I tell it, the Moon-Eyed were banished because they practiced what the Cherokee saw as dangerous magic, stuff that brought harmful spirits into the mountains. I say that's why the mountains sometimes go dead silent, like you've walked into a bubble of quiet that's thick enough to press down on your ears. When that happens, the hair on your neck stands up, and you know someone or something is watching. Most people disappear in those woods without a trace, I say, and if you're not careful, the Moon-Eyed will lure you deeper, away from the firelight and into the dark forest, where no one will find you. The trick is to trust your gut, to stay close to the fire, and pray the feeling passes. That's the story. A story I tell mostly for effect, to keep people alert and a little on edge when we're out there camping. Because the truth is, I've been camping those mountains all my life, and I've seen and heard things that no story can explain away. But none of it was ever supernatural. None of it involved ghosts or fairy tales. It was real, and that's what makes it worse. It was early September when I took a small group out to a spot I know well in the Smokies. The leaves were just beginning to turn, but the air was still warm enough during the day to sweat. Nights were cooler, the kind that made you pull your jacket tighter and think twice about leaving the fire. We set up camp near a little creek, tucked into a thick grove of hardwoods on a steep slope. The place was quiet except for the creek's steady murmur and the occasional crack of a twig beneath a raccoon or a deer moving through the brush. I chose this spot because it's isolated enough that you can feel the wild, but also close enough to a trail if you need to bail fast. I always tell people that if anything goes wrong, you don't want to be miles from help. We spent the day hiking, and when the sun started to slip behind the trees, we built a fire and settled in. I took the usual moment to tell the Moon-Eyed story, watching my group's faces go from casual to tense as the silence fell over the camp. The usual nervous glances toward the dark edges of the woods, the shifting eyes, the quick breaths. I could tell they wanted to laugh it off, but something about the quietness out there made the story feel possible, real even. As the fire died down to glowing embers, I noticed something different this time. Usually, there are small sounds. Birds settling in for the night, insects chirping, the rustle of small animals moving in the underbrush. But this night, that usual background noise stopped completely. Just like I said it would in the story, the mountains went dead silent. At first, I thought maybe it was just the time of night or a lull in animal movement. But the silence felt heavy, pressing, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I looked around the circle, and the others were stiff, staring into the dark like they were expecting something to jump out. I told myself it was just nerves, the story getting to them. But then I felt it myself. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was subtle at first, like a warning tingle, then stronger. My skin prickled, and the feeling crawled down my arms. It wasn't cold. It was something else, a sharp awareness that someone or something was out there, watching us from the shadows just beyond the firelight. I scanned the trees, looking for movement, but all I could see were black trunks blending into the night. I whispered to myself to stay calm and keep the fire going. The others didn't speak, but their eyes were wide, and I could see them shifting closer to the light. We sat frozen, the only sounds the soft crackle of the fire and the steady breathing of the group. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever, the kind of silence that makes you doubt what you're hearing and whether the next sound will be something good or something bad. I kept reminding myself that no matter what, we were safe here. The Moon-Eyed People are a story, an old legend. But when the forest presses down like that, all those stories feel a little too real. Around midnight, a faint noise stirred in the dark beyond the firelight. It was low and soft at first, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I couldn't tell what it was. A branch snapping? Leaves brushing together? The kind of sound you tell yourself is nothing, but your gut says otherwise. The group tensed again, and I noticed the sharp intake of breath from a couple of them. The noise repeated, soft, deliberate, too rhythmic to be just the wind. I swallowed hard, telling myself to focus, to listen carefully. The sound wasn't moving closer, but it wasn't going away either. I told the group to stay quiet and keep the fire alive. We didn't want to give whatever was out there a reason to come closer. I reached into my pack and pulled out a flashlight, flicking it on to scan the tree line. The beam cut through the blackness, highlighting the rough bark and scattered leaves. Nothing moved. I looked at the others and saw the same mixture of fear and disbelief I felt. We sat in silence, the flashlight beam cutting across the forest like a spotlight searching for answers. But the noise never got louder, never came into the firelight. Then, without warning, the noise stopped. The forest didn't just go silent again. Felt frozen, like it was waiting for something to happen next. The air grew thick, heavy with an unspoken threat. The hairs on my arms and neck were still standing up, and my heart was hammering in my chest. I told myself to breathe, to slow down, but my instincts were screaming to pack up and leave. The group looked at me, waiting for direction. I told them to stay calm, but to be ready to move if needed. We kept the fire alive, the glow pushing back the dark, but it felt fragile, like a candle fighting a sudden gust of wind. As the night wore on, we stayed alert, watching and listening. The usual sounds of the forest slowly returned. The chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant call of an owl. The tension eased a little, but none of us relaxed completely. By early morning, the sun was beginning to push the shadows away, and the forest came alive again with birdsong and the rustling of small animals. We packed up the camp, tired but safe. On the hike back, I thought about the silence and the strange noise from the night before. I didn't have any proof of what caused it. No footprints, no broken branches, no strange markings. Just that feeling, the knowledge that something had been there, watching us, maybe testing us. Looking back now, I realized the story of the Moon-Eyed People isn't just a spooky tale to tell around the fire. It's a warning. The mountains hold their secrets close, and sometimes those secrets watch back. They remind you that the forest isn't empty, even when it looks still. That feeling of being watched isn't imagination. It's survival. If you ever find yourself out there in the Smokies, near the edge of the firelight when the night grows quiet, trust your gut. The Moon-Eyed People might be just a story, but the mountains remember. They remember everything, and sometimes that memory is waiting for you in the silence. We were just a bunch of weekenders. Nothing special about us. A mix of people from a few towns around the state, all of us in our 30s, mostly professionals or tradespeople with some outdoor hobbies. We'd all met in one way or another, mutual friends, old classmates, cycling events, that sort of thing. We weren't a formal group or anything, just a handful of people who got along well and liked spending time outside. Some of us were couples, a few were single. We'd meet up every few weeks to camp, hike, bike, drink beer around a fire. No one tried too hard to organize anything big. It was always casual and familiar. That weekend was early April. Chilly at night, not a soul out there except us. We'd picked a small national forest campground, about 7 or 8 miles from the next closest site. This one had maybe a dozen total campsites, scattered apart, tucked back in trees, decent amount of space between each one. It wasn't peak season yet, so we didn't expect anyone else to be around, and no one was. The weather was good for April. Crisp air, cool but dry. Enough cloud cover to keep it from freezing overnight, but not so much that it felt gloomy. There were 10 of us that trip. 3 couples, including me and my husband. The rest were single friends, each with their own tent. We spread ourselves out across 4 campsites, but kept close enough that it felt like one big site. I think we took up sites 3, 4, 5, and 6. The group fire ring was set up at the biggest site, site 4, where most of us congregated. The day had been normal. We arrived around midday Saturday. Most of us had pulled in around the same time, give or take 30 minutes. By the time we'd unpacked and staked tents, the guys had already pulled some logs over for seating and cracked open a few beers. We made a small fire, went for a short walk along the creek behind camp, messed around on the trails nearby. Nothing serious, just stretching legs and breathing forest air. That night we grilled sausages, made s'mores, passed around a bottle of whiskey someone had brought. Around 11 p.m., people started peeling off to their tents. Some were already dozing by the fire before they got up. I stayed up maybe 10 or 15 minutes after everyone else. I wasn't tired yet, and I've always liked watching the fire wind down. The coals glowing red, wood hissing as it burned down to ash. It was quiet, almost silent. No wind, just a few bugs chirping and the faint trickle of water in the distance. I could hear one of the guys snoring already from 2 campsites over. Sound carried in the forest like it was nothing. Eventually, I put the fire out and went to bed. Our tent was one of those big rectangular ones, the kind that looks almost like a portable room. We had the queen-size air mattress, double thick. Took up most of the floor space. Our heads were toward the mesh windows that faced the edge of the forest. I zipped everything up, climbed into the sleeping bag, and laid there. Sleep didn't come easy. I wasn't scared or uneasy, just restless. Maybe the cold ground below the mattress, maybe the sounds. Like I said, almost all the guys snored. Loudly. One of the women did too. The way tents are spread out in a forest, you'd think you wouldn't hear much from the others. But when it's dead quiet out there, even soft noises come through clear. It was like a chorus of muffled, rhythmic growling. Not in sync, just overlapping, louder than you'd think. And once I heard it, I couldn't ignore it. I lay there, eyes open, staring up at the nylon ceiling of our tent, listening to all the odd rhythms of everyone else sleeping. I tossed and turned a bit, trying to find a better position, but every little rustle just made me more awake. My husband was snoring too, deep and steady. I kept glancing at my watch. Midnight, then 12:30. I checked one more time at 1 a.m. I was starting to finally feel that blurry edge of sleep coming on. Then I heard it. Footsteps. I knew it wasn't an animal immediately. The campground loop had a gravel road, the kind with rough, uneven rocks not compacted or paved. When people walk on it, you can hear the way the stones crunch under deliberate weight. These weren't random scuffles or rustling leaves. These were footsteps. Slow, steady, heavy. At first I thought it might be one of the guys getting up to pee or stretch his legs. But it didn't sound like that. It started from a ways down the road, maybe between sites 1 and 2, and came walking through the loop, moving at a measured pace. No hesitation, no stopping, just steady crunch, crunch, crunch. I lifted my head a little and listened harder. I didn't hear any zippers, no tents unzipping, no flashlight clicks. No voice, just the sound of footsteps, walking through the camp like whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. Not stumbling or unsure, just moving. I held my breath as it passed through the center of our camp loop. The steps were coming closer, and then it turned, right toward our tent. I don't know how I didn't freeze up completely. I stayed still, completely quiet. My heart was pounding so loud I thought whoever was out there might hear it. The steps moved off the gravel and onto the pine needle-covered earth beside our tent. Softer now, but still clearly a human gait. Then they stopped, just a foot or two behind our tent. They didn't say anything, didn't move. I lay there, my face turned toward the mesh window beside my head. It was dark out, but the clouds had thinned just enough that a bit of moonlight filtered through the trees. I couldn't see clearly, but I could see shapes. A figure knelt down slowly outside the window, and then they exhaled, loudly, forcefully, not like a sigh, like someone blowing out a deep breath right up against the mesh. I could hear the moisture in it, feel the air shift. It wasn't some casual noise. It was deliberate, directed. Then they stood back up and walked off. Not quickly, not hurried, just walked away, behind the tent and into the woods. And I kept listening as the steps moved up the steep hillside behind our campsite. Crunches, occasional loose rock, branches bending. They didn't stop. They didn't stumble. Just walked up the hill and disappeared. I couldn't move. My husband snored beside me, totally unaware. I wanted to shake him awake, but something in me said not to. I didn't even fully understand why. I think I was afraid that whoever had been out there might still be close, just out of sight. I felt like if I made any noise, it might bring them back. Eventually, I must have drifted off. I don't remember falling asleep, just remember opening my eyes and it being light. I woke up groggy, unrest. My neck ached. My mouth was dry. I sat up slowly, looked over at my husband, who was stretching and yawning like nothing had happened. I stepped outside and walked around to the back of the tent. That's when I saw it. Right next to the mesh window, on a short stubby bush that barely came up to my thigh, was a deer antler, still partly red, with bits of tissue clinging to the base. Not old, not sun-bleached, fresh, just one antler, like it had been torn off or cut away, balanced carefully on the branches like someone had placed it there. I looked around. No tracks, no sign of anything else. The ground was a little firm, and the pine needles didn't hold impressions well. But I knew what I'd heard. I went around to the other tents. Everyone was still waking up, stretching, brushing their teeth, heating up coffee. No one else had seen anything. No one else had heard anything. I asked quietly if anyone had gotten up during the night. Every one of them said no. A few laughed, saying they passed out hard after the drinks and hiking. One of the guys said he didn't even remember crawling into his tent. We had a small audio recorder we'd left on a stump near the fire ring overnight, mostly for fun. Sometimes we'd record coyotes or owls. I remembered it and grabbed it before we broke camp. When we played it back later that evening at home, we found the footsteps. Around 1:15 a.m., slow, heavy steps came into the audio. You could hear the pattern, then a faint shuffling off into the woods. But what got us all was what came later. At about 4:03 a.m., two voices, if you could even call them that. They didn't speak English, didn't speak any language I recognized. It wasn't animal growls or forest noise. It was actual chatter, like two people or things talking back and forth, not loud, but clear. One had a deeper tone, the other higher and faster. It didn't sound like gibberish. It had structure, rhythm, back and forth, like a conversation. 2 minutes of that, then silence. No one in our group could explain it. No cars ever came through that campground all weekend. We were miles from anyone else. We stayed until Sunday afternoon. Nothing else strange happened, but that night stayed with me. I've tried to explain it away. Maybe it was a hunter, someone out scouting early in the season. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe some bushcrafter living off-grid nearby. But nothing fits cleanly. Who walks into a remote campground at 1 a.m. just to kneel behind a stranger's tent and breathe against it? Who leaves a fresh I had been looking forward to that weekend for weeks. My sister and I had planned it out in early spring, waiting for the weather to finally settle enough in the mountains so we could head out without worrying about snowstorms or freezing nights. We picked a large, dispersed camping area up in the Rockies, a place we'd been to once before with our boyfriends a year prior. It wasn't an official campground. No numbered sites, no running water, no bathrooms, but that's what we liked about it. You could drive in and find a nice patch of dirt, set up your tent, and have space to yourself. The views were amazing, too. Thick pine forests all around, mountains in the distance, and the kind of deep quiet you don't get closer to town. This time it was just going to be us for the first night, me, my sister, and our 2 dogs. My blue heeler, Jasper, was always with me on these trips. He was high energy but calm, smart as a whip, and usually pretty mellow around people. My sister had a Norwegian elk hound named Freya. She was a little more territorial than Jasper, but obedient and very alert. Our boyfriends had work on Friday, but they were planning to meet us up there sometime late Saturday afternoon and stay until Monday. We figured one night alone was no big deal. We were both experienced with camping, we had cell signal up there in certain spots, and we had 2 tough dogs. What could go wrong? We left early Friday morning, stopping in town for some groceries and gas before the long drive up into the hills. The road turned to gravel after a while, winding up past tall trees and ridges, until we finally reached the open meadow-like area where campers were free to post up wherever they could fit. There were already a few groups up there when we arrived, some further off in the trees, a couple vans parked on the far side of the field, and what looked like a family with kids nearer to the creek. But there was plenty of space between everyone. We drove around for a few minutes until we found a good spot near the treeline with a little shade and enough room to set up our tent and a campfire ring. We had just parked and opened the doors when I saw 2 guys walking toward us from about 30 yards away. I didn't recognize them from the drive-in, but I could tell they weren't from any of the campsites we'd passed. They looked like they'd come out of the trees or from behind one of the ridges. Mid-30s maybe, both wearing dirty-looking jeans and hoodies, one in a backwards ball cap. The way they walked up to us felt too fast, too direct. Not casual, like someone taking a stroll and saying hey. More like they'd seen us pull in and made a beeline for us. The second I noticed them, I noticed the dogs too. Jasper, who had been sitting in the front seat with his head out the window, jumped out and stood rigid, hackles fully up. He let out a low growl that turned into a sharp bark. I'd never seen him like that, not even around drunk people or when a bear came too close once. At the same time, Freya, who'd been sniffing around in the back, suddenly planted herself between us and the men and started barking too. She was baring her teeth and had her ears flat back, almost vibrating with tension. The guys hesitated only for a second when the dogs started losing it. Then, just like that, they turned around and walked away. Not in a rush, but not slow either. I watched them go back behind a small rise where we couldn't see them anymore. My sister and I didn't say anything at first. We were both just watching, trying to process what that had been. Jasper was still stiff and alert for another full minute after they were gone, scanning the area with his eyes and nose. I finally started unloading the gear, but I couldn't shake the feeling those guys had shown up with a purpose. Something about the way they came straight toward us without a greeting, without hesitation. They hadn't looked like campers. No packs, no water bottles, not even dust on their boots. They looked like they'd walked out of nowhere, or like they were hiding somewhere nearby, watching. We finished setting up camp, trying to push the encounter to the back of our minds. But even after we ate lunch and went for a short hike with the dogs, I kept looking over my shoulder. I started noticing things more than I usually would. Every snapped twig made me turn my head. Every squirrel in the brush had me checking twice. And the dogs, well, they never fully relaxed after that point. Freya especially kept sitting upright near the edge of camp, watching in the direction the men had gone. Jasper would lie down, but he never dozed off like he usually would. His ears kept twitching toward the woods. Around sunset, we gathered some firewood and got a little campfire going. The plan was to hang out for a while, maybe have a drink, then turn in early so we'd be rested when the guys came up the next day. But as dusk fell, that unsettled feeling came back hard. Every time I got up to get something from the car, I could feel the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. We hadn't seen the men again, but I kept feeling like we were being watched. Then we saw them again. The first time was maybe 8 p.m. or so. The light was fading, and we were sitting near the fire, keeping close to the flames and petting the dogs who were both on edge. I turned to grab my flashlight off the cooler, and in that second, I caught movement on the far side of our vehicle. A figure, one of them was walking past behind our car, maybe 20 feet from us, not looking over, not making eye contact, just walking slowly past like he was taking a stroll, even though there was nothing back there but trees and darkness. Jasper let out a bark so sudden and sharp it made me jump. Freya lunged toward the direction he'd gone, nearly yanking the leash from my sister's hand. By the time we stood up and got our lights on, he was gone. Just trees and dirt and silence. And that wasn't the last time. It happened 3 more times that night. Once around 9:30, once just before midnight, and again around 2 in the morning. Always just one of them, always the same casual walk behind our camp. Never approaching, never speaking, never carrying anything. Just moving past, staying far enough to not be confrontational, close enough to let us know they were still there. Each time the dogs went wild, and each time they disappeared without a sound. There was no way they were going to or from a bathroom. There weren't any. No outhouses, no portables, nothing. There were trees all around. If they needed to go, they could do it anywhere. There was no path or trail behind our camp either. Just steep ground, scrubby brush, and forest. There was no reason to be back there unless they were deliberately circling us. After the second time, we moved the car so that it blocked part of the view behind us. Didn't help much. The fire started to die out around 1 a.m., and we didn't want to attract too much attention by building it up again. Instead, we sat in the dark with just our headlamps, barely speaking, holding on to the dogs' leashes with white knuckles. By the time we saw the figure the 4th time, around 2 in the morning, I had the hatchet in my lap. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it if it came down to it, but I wasn't going to be caught off guard. Freya paced back and forth, growling low and steady like she was waiting for someone to make a move. Jasper kept his eyes locked on the trees. Neither dog would rest, not even for a second. We didn't sleep that night. I kept waiting for something worse to happen, for footsteps coming closer, for a shadow against the tent wall, for something, but it never happened. Just the quiet woods, and that terrible, heavy feeling like something was being held just out of reach. Around 5 in the morning, the birds started chirping and the sky lightened to gray. We took that as our cue to start moving. I made coffee on the little propane burner and walked out to the edge of the site to pee, keeping my knife on me the entire time. When I got back, my sister was already packing up the cooler and putting things in the car. We didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. We were both just moving, trying to make it to the next part of the plan. By mid-morning, we had things cleaned up a bit and sat in the sun, exhausted. I kept looking over the tree line, waiting to see those guys again. They never showed. Not once during the daylight. Late in the afternoon, we finally heard the familiar sound of the boys' trucks rolling up the dirt road. I felt some of the weight drop off my shoulders. Not all of it, but enough. My sister smiled for the first time all day. Jasper actually wagged his tail. After the guys got there, we told them what had happened. They took it seriously. Both of them kept knives on them the whole weekend, and we made sure the campfire stayed going into the night. We didn't see the men again. No more figures. No more walks behind the car. No more flashes of movement in the trees. It was like they had vanished. But I don't think they left. I think they were still up there, somewhere in the woods, watching. I think they were waiting to see if we were alone. I think they were testing something that night. If we hadn't had the dogs, I don't know how it would have gone. If Jasper hadn't barked like he did, if Freya hadn't been on high alert every second, maybe those guys would have gotten closer. Maybe they would have tried something worse. I haven't gone back to that spot since. We've camped other places, but that area, something about it changed for me. Now, when I think of dispersed camping in remote places, I don't just think of bears or the weather or getting lost. I think of people, of the way those men moved through the dark like they belonged there, the way they vanished the second backup arrived. It's easy to think you're safe because it's just nature, but sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't a mountain lion or a thunderstorm. It's someone watching you from My husband and I had been planning the Oregon trip for months. We were both in desperate need of a break. Work had been hectic, the city noise was getting to us, and we hadn't had any real time together that wasn't interrupted by something. Phones, emails, work schedules, traffic, errands. Everything in life lately had felt loud and busy. So when the fall season rolled around and we both managed to sync up a long weekend off, we didn't waste time booking a site at one of the small campgrounds nestled in the wooded foothills outside Eugene. I don't remember the name of it anymore, but I do remember it being one of those lesser-known campgrounds that people sometimes skipped in favor of the bigger state parks nearby. That's exactly what we wanted. Something quieter. Something away from the families with kids screaming and dogs barking all day long. Something peaceful. And it really was for most of the trip. We towed our hard-sided trailer up on a Thursday afternoon. The drive had been smooth, winding through forest roads, with bright orange and deep red leaves drifting across the two-lane blacktop. The air was cool but not freezing, just enough to need a sweatshirt when we stepped outside. I remember thinking how nice it was to finally smell real pine again. There's something about Pacific Northwest forests, how the moss clings to everything, how the fog settles in the low parts of the trees, how you feel tucked away from the world even if a highway isn't all that far away. The campground was tiny, maybe a dozen spots in total, and when we rolled in, only 3 others were occupied. One RV was at the far end of the loop, a tent set up a few spots down from that, and one other small trailer closer to the entrance. We picked a site on the edge of the loop where the trees were thicker, giving us more privacy. There were no hookups, but we didn't care. We had solar panels, a full water tank, and plenty of food and propane to last the weekend. Felt perfect. The first 2 nights were everything we needed. We did short hikes during the day, nothing too strenuous, just following trails down to small creeks and back. In the evenings, we sat by the fire pit, sipping on wine, eating simple dinners cooked over the camp stove, and listening to the crackling of pine needles beneath the firewood. We'd crawl into bed early, reading or just talking until we dozed off. There were no loud campers, no music, no generators humming at night. The air was crisp and quiet. It was the kind of quiet you only get deep in the woods. No background hum, no cars in the distance, no city lights bleeding into the sky. That third night, Saturday, was when everything changed. We'd spent the day walking a trail that looped around a marshy area not far from the campground. It was cooler than the previous days, and a light drizzle started just as we were finishing the loop. It felt like fall had fully set in. The trees dropping more leaves, the ground damp, the smell of wet earth rising up with every step. When we got back, we were both ready to just relax. We skipped building a fire that night and cooked dinner inside the trailer. We left our camp chairs folded up and stayed inside reading after dinner. I remember feeling a little uneasy for no real reason, just one of those odd feelings that come and go. I told myself it was probably the cold drizzle and the fact that we hadn't seen another person all day, even though we knew a few sites were still occupied. Sometimes that can get to you, being alone in the woods with just the sound of your own footsteps for hours. We climbed into bed a little after 10:30 p.m. The blinds were drawn, the interior lights off, and everything locked up. One of the last things I remember doing was checking my phone signal, 2 bars LTE. That made me feel better, though I wasn't expecting to need it. I don't know how long I had been asleep when it started. The first thing I registered was the sound. Loud, sudden banging, metallic and sharp, like fists or something harder slamming into the outside of our trailer. It wasn't gentle. It was the kind of banging that instantly fills your chest with adrenaline. I bolted upright in bed, heart racing, brain still foggy from sleep. For a moment, I couldn't tell if I was dreaming, but then it happened again. Bang, bang, bang. Someone was outside. My husband was already up, his hand fumbling for the light switch, which he thankfully didn't turn on. Everything inside stayed dark. I think we both instinctively knew not to light ourselves up like that. We whispered harsh, short bursts of questions that neither of us could really answer. The pounding continued. Then I heard shouting. A man's voice yelling something, muffled, angry. I couldn't make out the words at first. Then the banging stopped, and I heard it more clearly. It was something like, "You think this is funny?" And then more unintelligible yelling. slurred and forceful. More swearing. Something about not fair and fuck this place. My husband and I froze. All the blinds were drawn, and we couldn't see a damn thing. We didn't know if this person was alone or with others, if he had a weapon, if he was even talking to us or someone else. But the way he had hit our trailer, it felt personal, like he thought we had done something, like he was trying to get in. My husband moved toward the small drawer where we kept the kitchen knives and quietly pulled one out. I could hear the blade scrape lightly against the plastic divider. I was still clutching my phone. I don't remember dialing 911, but my thumb must have hit the emergency call button. I put the phone to my ear and whispered that we were in a trailer at a campground in the woods and that someone was outside yelling and banging on us. The dispatcher asked questions I barely processed. I gave them the campground name and described the man's voice, told them we thought he was drunk. I tried to keep my voice down, terrified the man would hear us talking. The yelling outside continued, but now it sounded like it was moving away. Not far, just a few steps, like he had walked across the gravel road or to another spot in the campsite. Then it got quiet. No yelling, no banging, just the sound of our shallow breathing and the hum of silence returning. The dispatcher told me a local officer was on his way. I hung up and sat there clutching the knife, knees pulled up to my chest, every sound outside magnified by fear. I was trying to figure out what the hell just happened. Why had he been hitting our trailer? Who was he talking to? What did we have to do with anything? Eventually, we heard a car coming up the gravel loop. Not fast, but not slow either. Headlights washed through the trees, and a few seconds later, we saw red and blue lights bouncing off the ceiling of the trailer. We stepped outside carefully, the knife still in my husband's hand. The officer told us to stay back and asked what happened. We explained everything as calmly as we could. How the man had been yelling about something not being fair, hitting our trailer, and then going quiet. The officer walked across the loop toward one of the tents we had seen earlier. The voice we'd heard had sounded like it came from that direction, and even as the officer approached, we could faintly hear someone talking to himself in that same angry tone. Muttering, mostly, sounded like he was still drunk. The officer shone his flashlight toward the tent, said something we couldn't hear, and stood there for a few minutes. Eventually, he came back to us and said the man claimed he thought we had his dog locked in our trailer. That made zero sense. We hadn't seen a dog all weekend. We hadn't seen that man at all, period. The officer said the guy was drunk but not being violent at that moment and that he'd warned him to calm down or risk being taken in. That was it. He got back in his car and left the campground. Just like that. We stood there under the dim glow of the trailer's porch light, stunned. We walked back inside and locked everything again. I kept the knife next to me in bed. Neither of us could sleep. Every sound made my heart jump. Wind in the trees, an acorn dropping on the roof, the distant creak of something shifting in the cold. It all sounded suspicious now. I think we dozed off sometime around 5 a.m., just as the sky started to pale. When I woke up again around 7, I looked out the window and saw that the tent across the loop was being broken down. A man and a woman, maybe early 30s, were packing quickly, shoving things into the back of an old SUV. There was a dog too, sitting quietly near the passenger door. A black and white mutt, maybe some kind of terrier mix, very much not inside our trailer. They left without a word, tires kicking up dust as they pulled out of the campground and drove off down the forest road. We didn't leave that morning. We stayed, mostly because we didn't want to pack up in a rush and also because part of us felt like we'd survived the worst of it. But the mood had shifted completely. That peaceful calm was gone. Every noise still made me jump. Every car that came down the road made my stomach tighten. I couldn't relax anymore, not after that. We spent that day doing very little. Just walked a short trail, made some lunch, and talked about what we'd do differently next time. We agreed on one thing. Never again would we camp somewhere without a cell signal. We used to love going off-grid, camping where there wasn't even a bar of service. But not anymore. If we hadn't had a signal that night, I don't know how long we would have waited, what we would have done, or how it might have escalated. We left the next morning, packed up slowly, tried to pretend things were normal again, but they weren't. That experience stuck with us for a long time, changed the way we camped. We upgraded our trailer door locks, installed motion light. I've been looking forward to this weekend for months. After weeks of work piling up and the constant noise of the city, I wanted nothing more than a break somewhere quiet, far from people. I found a small cabin listed for rent deep in the woods, about 2 hours from the nearest town. It wasn't fancy, just a small wooden cabin with no electricity, no internet, and a well for water. Exactly what I wanted, a real chance to disconnect and clear my head. The drive out was long but peaceful. I left the highway behind and took a narrow dirt road that twisted through thick pine forests. The air got colder as I went deeper, and the trees grew taller, blocking out much of the fading sunlight by the time I arrived. The cabin sat in a little clearing, surrounded on all sides by dense forest. It looked old but sturdy, with dark wooden planks and a slanted tin roof. A small porch wrapped around the front with a wooden rocking chair pushed to one side. A rusty metal woodpile sat near the porch, full of split logs. It had a rustic charm to it. I parked my car and pulled out my bags. I wasn't expecting anyone else to be around, and sure enough, the place was silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was tiny, a main room with a small kitchen corner, a wood stove, and a narrow table with 2 chairs. In one corner was a bed with a thin mattress and rough blankets. A small bookshelf held a handful of old books and a faded map of the surrounding area. I set down my bags and looked out the window. The sun was setting fast, turning the sky pink and orange behind the trees. I planned to spend the night here, then hike some trails the next day before heading back. Simple and peaceful. The first night was quiet except for the usual forest sounds. Birds calling, leaves falling, distant animals moving through the underbrush. I had a small propane lantern I'd brought with me, so I lit that and made a simple dinner on the stove. Canned beans warmed up with some bread I'd packed. I ate while sitting at the table, watching shadows shift on the walls. As darkness fully settled, I felt a familiar calm wash over me. The silence here was unlike anything in the city. No cars, no voices, no buzz of electricity. Just the deep, thick quiet of the wilderness. I got ready for bed, stacking some firewood near the stove, and closed the door and windows tightly. The old cabin creaked a little with the cool night breeze, but otherwise everything was still. I lay down on the narrow bed and pulled the blankets over me. I wasn't especially tired, but the quiet made me relaxed. I thought I'd fall asleep easily, but then I heard it. At first, it was faint, a low, dragging sound coming from outside the cabin, like something heavy being pulled through dry leaves or broken branches. I sat up, listening hard. The sound stopped, then started again, slow and deliberate. My heart began to beat faster. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some animal passing nearby. I tried to focus on breathing and calm down. Then, after a minute or two, I heard a different sound. A soft knocking on the outside wooden wall of the cabin. Not loud, but deliberate, slow knocks, spaced out, like someone tapping with their fingers. I froze. My mind raced. Who or what could be outside at this hour? The cabin was miles from the nearest road, and I hadn't seen any other people when I arrived. The knocking stopped after a few seconds, but then the dragging sound returned. This time it was closer. I could hear something scraping against the wooden porch, moving along the edge. I grabbed the small flashlight I kept on the nightstand and shone it out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I could see were shadows and trees. No sign of anyone or anything. I debated opening the door to check, but the thought of stepping outside into the dark woods, possibly alone with whoever was out there, made me freeze. Instead, I locked the door again and closed the curtains. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure the noise must be loud enough for anyone outside to hear. I sat up the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, eyes glued to the window. Every now and then, I heard the sounds again, scraping, knocking, or the faint crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. But whenever I shone the light outside, there was nothing. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved that the noises stopped as soon as daylight broke. I decided to leave that same day. I packed up quickly, leaving the cabin exactly as I found it, and started down the dirt road toward the highway. But on the way out, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Near the edge of the clearing, halfway hidden under some fallen branches, was a set of footprints. Large, heavy prints pressed deep into the soft dirt, following the path from the woods to the cabin and back. They weren't animal prints. They looked like a person's boots. That's when I realized the noises I'd heard weren't random forest sounds or wildlife. Someone had been outside the cabin, walking around it, scraping against the porch, knocking on the walls. I called the local sheriff's office as soon as I got back to cell service, and they told me they'd had a report of break-ins in that area. Apparently, some squatters or thieves had been targeting remote cabins, sneaking in at night to steal supplies or hide out. The sheriff warned me to be careful if I ever went back. I never went back. Weeks later, I thought about what had happened that night a lot. The feeling of being watched, the sounds just outside my door, and the footprints made me realize how vulnerable I'd been. No ghosts, no monsters, just the very real danger of being alone in the wilderness with someone who didn't belong there. I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't stories or legends, but just plain human threats. Strangers with unknown intentions, stalking in the dark. And that night in the cabin, miles from anyone else, taught me to respect how exposed you can be out there. Now, when I go camping or stay in cabins, I make sure to check the area thoroughly, keep my phone charged, and never ignore noises outside my door. Because the forest may be quiet, but it's not always safe. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a chance to get away from the noise and stress of the city and spend some time alone in the woods. I found a small cabin for rent about 5 hours away from where I lived. It wasn't fancy or anything special, just a basic wooden cabin, old but sturdy, deep in the forest, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. I figured it was perfect. The drive there took most of the day, winding through narrow country roads until I finally reached a gravel path that led off into the forest. The cabin itself sat on a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and oaks. The air smelled fresh and a little damp, the ground soft with pine needles. The place was quiet, too quiet maybe, but that was exactly what I wanted. Inside, the cabin was small, maybe 2 rooms at most. There was a main room with a fireplace, a wooden table with a couple of chairs, a small kitchen corner with a sink and stove, and a tiny bathroom. Up a steep ladder was a loft with a mattress and blankets. I unpacked my bag, stacked some firewood next to the fireplace, and made myself some instant coffee. I planned to spend the evening sitting by the fire, reading a book and enjoying the solitude. As the sun started to set, the woods darkened quickly. I lit the fire and settled in, the warm glow filling the room. Outside, the wind rustled the trees gently, and distant bird calls echoed. I was glad I had a phone signal here, just enough to check in on messages, but not enough to be a distraction. I felt safe, alone in the quiet. After a while, I noticed something odd. There was a sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon rustling through the underbrush. But then I heard footsteps, heavy, slow footsteps moving carefully but steadily through the leaves. They stopped and started again. I was sure someone or something was out there. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just a hunter or another hiker passing by. But I hadn't seen a car on the road for miles. I wasn't expecting anyone else here. I double-checked the locks on the door and windows, even though they had seemed secure already. The footsteps circled the clearing, moving closer to the cabin. Then I heard something I hadn't expected, whispers, low, muffled voices, too soft to make out clearly, but definitely human. That was when my heart started pounding. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my phone and started to dial 911, but the signal was gone. It must have dropped out as it got darker. I tried to call again, but no luck. The feeling of isolation sank in deeper. I decided to stay quiet and watch from the window. I could barely make out figures moving between the trees, their outlines blurred by the shadows. They stayed at the edge of the clearing, almost like they were waiting for something. I wondered if they had seen me or if they didn't know I was inside. I sat frozen for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of footsteps and whispered voices around the cabin. Occasionally, I heard a branch snap or a dry leaf crunch underfoot. My mind raced, thinking of all the worst possibilities. Burglars, hunters who might be dangerous, or worse. I thought about leaving, but the woods were dark and thick. I didn't know the trails well, and without a flashlight, it would be nearly impossible to find my way back to the road safely. The idea of stepping outside felt more dangerous than staying put. Eventually, the footsteps and voices faded. Maybe they left or moved away. I kept the fire burning and stayed alert the whole night, unable to sleep even a minute. Every little noise made me jump. The creaks and groans of the old cabin settled around me, and I wished I had someone with me to share the fear. When dawn finally broke, the light streaming in made the cabin feel less ominous. I opened the door cautiously. The clearing looked empty. No footprints, no signs anyone had been there except for some crushed leaves and broken twigs. I walked toward the road as fast as I could, heart still pounding. I was lucky to find a passing car within a few minutes. I flagged it down and asked to be taken to the nearest town. At the police station, I reported what happened. They said no other visitors or campers had been registered nearby, but they would send someone to check the cabin. They advised me not to go back alone. That was the last thing I wanted, to go back to that cabin. But I needed to pack up my things, so a friend agreed to drive out with me the next day. When we arrived, the police had already been there. They found some footprints, definitely human, but no other signs of damage or forced entry. Nothing was stolen. It seemed like whoever had been there was just passing through or watching. We packed up quickly, and as we left, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even from the safety of the car. That trip was supposed to be peaceful and quiet. Instead, it became a lesson in how real fear can come from the unknown, the invisible presence of people who don't belong and won't explain themselves. Back home, I changed the locks on my apartment and made sure my doors were always double-locked. I realized how easy it was to feel safe in familiar places and how quickly that could change when alone and vulnerable in the woods. The cabin is still there, quiet in the forest. I've heard that some people go back to it, but I never will, because sometimes the scariest things are the ones you don't see. People lurking in the dark, watching, waiting, and you have no idea why or what they want. I didn't expect the trip to turn out the way it did. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend away in the cabin, alone, just me and the woods. I'd spent years living in the city, and after a long stretch of stress at work, I wanted nothing more than peace and some fresh air. The cabin was nothing fancy. A small, old wooden structure about 20 miles from the nearest town, nestled deep in the forest. I had booked it through a friend who owned it but wasn't going to be using it for the weekend. The place didn't have electricity or running water. It was basic: a wood stove, a few old beds, a small kitchen area with a sink but no plumbing, and an outhouse a short walk away. The surrounding forest was dense, full of pine and fir trees, with narrow dirt paths barely visible under the thick blanket of pine needles. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The sky was already turning soft orange as the sun set behind the hills. I parked my car on a small gravel patch beside the cabin and unloaded my backpack. The air smelled of pine sap and damp earth, the kind of fresh scent city air never had. I unlocked the cabin door. The old wooden door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled musty but clean, with a faint trace of old wood smoke. I dropped my bag near the door and took a moment to look around. The furniture was simple: a rough wooden table, a couple of chairs, a single bed with a thin mattress and wool blanket, and the old stove tucked into the corner. I started a fire in the stove using dry pine branches I found outside. The fire caught easily, and soon the room was warm and glowing with a soft, orange light. I opened a window to let the fresh air in and leaned out for a moment, taking in the quiet. No sounds of cars or people, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a crow. I felt a strange kind of calm, a stillness I hadn't felt in years. I spent the evening reading an old paperback I brought and drinking coffee from a thermos. As the night grew darker, the only light came from the stove and the small oil lamp on the table. I checked my phone, no signal. That was fine. I wanted to disconnect. Around 10 p.m., I went outside to use the outhouse before bed. The moon was full and bright, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I noticed that the woods felt denser than I had imagined, the trees close enough to block much of the horizon. Back inside, I zipped up the windows and settled onto the bed. The cabin was warm, but the thin mattress made it hard to get comfortable. I drifted off slowly, the sounds of the night around me. Around midnight, something woke me. I couldn't tell if it was a noise or just a feeling. The forest outside was alive with sound. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, something moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, deer or raccoons, but there was something off about it, a rhythm to the noise that didn't match normal animal sounds. I lay still, eyes wide open, listening. There was a low, slow crunching coming from the edge of the trees, the kind of noise you'd hear when someone was walking carefully but deliberately through dry leaves and twigs. I strained my eyes in the dark but couldn't see anything beyond the thin curtains of the window. I got up and grabbed a flashlight from the table, clicking it on. The beam cut through the window glass, reaching out into the darkness. I swung it slowly around the clearing. Nothing, just trees and shadows. But the noises kept coming, slow, deliberate steps circling around the cabin. I realized then that something or someone was out there, walking around the cabin. I felt a cold rush of fear. The door was just a few feet away, wooden and thin. If someone wanted in, they could break it easily. I moved toward it slowly, heart pounding, and checked the locks. It was bolted from the inside, but the wood around the frame looked old and weak. I grabbed a large kitchen knife from the counter and sat back down, flashlight in hand, waiting. The footsteps circled the cabin for what felt like an hour. Sometimes they stopped, then started again, sometimes moving faster, sometimes slower. I could hear breathing, heavy and irregular. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of something wet and metallic. I tried not to think about it, telling myself it could be a hunter, someone lost, or even an animal. As dawn approached, the footsteps finally stopped. I heard a soft thud against the back wall of the cabin, like something heavy hitting wood. Then silence. When the first pale light hit the cabin windows, I crept outside, knife still in hand. The ground around the cabin was soft from recent rain. I saw footprints, heavy, booted prints circling the cabin. The prints were large, definitely human. They stopped at the back wall, where I saw a deep scratch in the wood, long and jagged, like someone had tried to pry the wall open or strike at it. I felt shaken but also oddly relieved. Whoever had been out there had gone away with the daylight. I took out my phone and, to my surprise, I got a weak signal. I called the local sheriff's office and reported the footprints and the noises. The deputy told me they had reports of some break-ins in the area, mostly cabins like mine, from a group of local thieves who target isolated homes to steal supplies and anything valuable. They had been chasing them for weeks but hadn't caught them yet. I stayed in the cabin that day, too scared to leave. I cleaned up the scratch with some wood filler I found and tried to reinforce the door with heavy furniture. The deputy came back late in the afternoon, promising to check the area more often. The rest of the weekend passed quietly. I stayed inside after dark, never leaving the cabin without someone with me. When Monday came, I packed up and left, my heart still heavy with unease. In the end, it wasn't ghosts or monsters that scared me. It was the real, tangible danger of someone stalking the woods, someone who could break in and hurt me if I wasn't careful. The woods were beautiful and peaceful by day, but at night, they held threats I never expected. I never went back to that cabin again. I should start by explaining how I ended up in that cabin in the first place. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a quiet weekend getaway to get away from the city and clear my head. The plan was simple. Drive up to a small, remote cabin I rented through a local site, spend a couple of days alone, hike the surrounding woods, read a bit, maybe do some writing. I'd done similar solo trips before, so nothing about it seemed risky or unusual. The cabin was supposed to be off the grid, no electricity, just a wood stove for heat, a well for water, and a tiny propane stove for cooking. The whole place was about 10 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a rough dirt track that wound through dense forest. The last couple miles were especially narrow and overgrown, the kind of place where you'd expect to see a deer or two if you were lucky. I had to park my car at the edge of the trailhead and hike the rest of the way carrying my gear. I had a backpack with all the essentials: food, water, clothes, a first aid kit, a map, compass, and a solid flashlight with fresh batteries. The weather forecast had promised clear skies, and I was looking forward to a few nights away from the noise and stress of everyday life. The first day went as planned. The hike in was longer than I expected because the trail was poorly marked and some sections were blocked by fallen branches. I kept stopping to brush away spider webs and watch my footing carefully on the slippery dirt. When I finally saw the cabin, I was relieved. It was a small wooden structure, weathered but sturdy, with a rusty metal roof and a stone chimney. There was a little porch with a creaky wooden bench and an old, faded welcome mat. The windows had no glass, just wooden shutters, one of which hung crookedly from a single hinge. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and a faint hint of mildew. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the only furniture was a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a metal bed frame with a thin mattress, and the wood stove. A stack of firewood sat neatly piled in a corner. There was no cell service here, just the faintest hint of radio static if I held the receiver just right. I unpacked slowly, setting up my sleeping bag on the mattress and arranging my food on the table. I made a small fire in the stove, its warmth quickly filling the room, and then settled down with a book as the sun sank behind the trees. That first night was quiet, the forest around me alive with the sounds of crickets and distant owls. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in the comforting warmth of the fire. I slept in my clothes, boots and all, just in case. The next day I woke early, before dawn. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and damp earth. I ate a simple breakfast of instant oatmeal and tea, then packed a small day pack with water and snacks to explore the nearby trails. I wanted to see the small lake the rental site mentioned in the description. The hike was peaceful, the woods dense but not unnerving. Birds flitted between branches and small animals rustled through the underbrush. The lake was smaller than I'd imagined, but beautiful. A mirror of still water surrounded by tall pines and rocky outcrops. I sat on a flat boulder at the shore for a while, watching the sunlight play on the surface. It was a perfect place to be alone and think. When I returned to the cabin in the afternoon, I noticed something strange. The door, which I was sure I'd locked before leaving, was slightly ajar. I didn't panic. Maybe I had forgotten to latch it properly in my rush. I closed it firmly and checked the inside. Nothing seemed disturbed. My backpack was still where I'd left it, the food untouched. No sign of anyone having been inside. Still, a little unease settled in my stomach. I decided to make the fire bigger, hoping the heat and light would make me feel safer as the evening came. I prepared a simple dinner of canned beans warmed on the stove, then settled by the fire, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. As darkness fell, the sounds of the forest changed. The daytime birds quieted, replaced by insects and the occasional hoot of an owl. The wind rustled the pine needles overhead, making the cabin's wooden walls creak softly. I went outside to the porch to look at the stars, which were bright and clear in the absence of light pollution. For a moment, I thought I could hear footsteps in the distance, but when I strained my ears, all I could hear was the soft murmur of the forest. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake listening to the cabin's noises, the wood settling, the occasional tapping of a branch against the roof. At one point, I thought I heard whispering just outside the window, but when I looked, the forest was still. The shadows cast by the fire flickered on the walls, and the silence felt heavy. I didn't hear anything else until the middle of the night. That was when it started. At first, it was just a low sound, like the groaning of a tree or maybe an animal moving in the underbrush. I lay perfectly still, listening. Then it became clearer. A sort of scraping noise, slow and deliberate, coming from outside the cabin. It wasn't random. It was methodical. I wanted to tell myself it was a bear or a deer, or some other wild animal, but the sound didn't match anything I'd ever heard. It was too steady, too purposeful, like someone dragging something heavy across the ground. I tried to quiet my breathing and listen, but then the scraping stopped, replaced by a heavy thump against the cabin wall. My heart hammered in my chest. I forced myself to stay calm and reached for the flashlight on the table beside my bed. I didn't want to open the door. Not yet. I switched on the light and pointed it toward the door, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, a sharp knock sounded on the door. Not loud, but distinct. Another knock followed, slower this time. Then silence. I didn't move. I stayed frozen, holding the flashlight, my ears straining for any other sounds. The knocking came again, this time from the side window. I jumped up and grabbed the axe I'd brought for firewood. The cabin felt suddenly small and vulnerable. I wanted to shout or call for help, but I remembered there was no phone signal. No one was coming out here. I was alone. The knocking stopped, but the heavy scraping started again. This time, it moved around the cabin's perimeter, slow and steady, as if someone was walking around it dragging something. I stepped cautiously to the window, shining the flashlight out. The beam fell on the ground, but the forest beyond was empty. No shapes, no movement. I stayed awake the rest of the night, heart pounding, gripping the axe, ready for anything. Morning came slowly. The sun filtered weakly through the trees, and the forest seemed peaceful again, almost innocent. I looked around the cabin's exterior to see if anything was out of place. That's when I noticed the marks. Deep scratches gouged the wood near the door and windows, long, jagged lines, as if someone had tried to pry them open with a tool. The porch steps had deep scuff marks, like heavy boots had been dragged there, but there was no sign of anyone around. No footprints in the soft dirt or fresh tire tracks on the road. I checked my pack and belongings. Nothing was missing, yet the feeling of intrusion lingered, like someone had been watching me for hours. The rest of the day, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept a fire burning in the stove, packed my bag in case I had to leave quickly, and scanned the woods with my binoculars, but the forest remained silent. That night was worse. The noises returned, louder and more frequent. Heavy footsteps thumped around the cabin. The scraping sounded like metal on wood, and every few minutes, there were sharp knocks on the door and windows. I didn't sleep. I paced the cabin, axe in hand, listening for any sign of what was out there. At one point, the door handle rattled, as if someone was trying to open it. The thought made me freeze. Whoever was out there knew I was inside. I stayed awake until dawn, tired, scared, and desperate. The next morning, I decided to leave. I didn't care about the weekend anymore. I packed everything quickly, trying not to look outside too much. When I stepped out, the forest looked normal, calm even. The sun was shining, birds chirping, but the marks on the cabin's walls told a different story. There were new scratches I hadn't seen the day before, deeper and fresher. I hurried down the trail toward my car, my heart racing every time I heard a snap of a twig behind me. When I finally reached the dirt road and got in my car, I locked the doors and sat for a long moment, shaking. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following, but the road behind was empty. Once back in town, I reported the incident to the local ranger station. They told me it wasn't uncommon for people to wander into the area, either hunters or trespassers, and that I was lucky nothing worse had happened. The forest was remote, and sometimes people got lost or camped illegally. I learned later that some local hunters had been arrested for breaking into cabins in the area, stealing supplies and vandalizing property. It made me wonder if whoever had been at my cabin was one of them, or worse. I never went back to I'd been looking forward to the trip for months. After a long stretch of work and the usual chaos of life, I needed to get away. really get away. No phone signal, no internet, just me and a small cabin deep in the woods. I had found the cabin online, a rental tucked far from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest, a small dirt road leading up to it that was barely maintained. The pictures looked perfect. Weathered wood, a stone chimney, a porch with an old rocking chair, a small lake visible through the trees a few hundred yards away. The kind of place where you imagine being completely alone with nature. When I arrived, late afternoon in early October, the air had that sharp, cool bite that comes before winter. The trees were a mix of orange, red, and brown, leaves thick on the ground. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trunks. The road had been rough, but the Jeep made it without trouble, and the moment I stepped out, I felt a strange stillness. No wind, no birds singing, just a quiet that felt almost unnatural in its depth. The cabin was as pictured, maybe even more worn in person. The wood was gray and splintered in places. The windows were small and grimy, and the door creaked loudly when I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of old wood, damp earth, and a faint hint of smoke from the old stone fireplace that dominated one wall. There was a small kitchen area with a sink and a rusty stove, a table with peeling paint, and a couple of chairs. A narrow staircase led up to a loft where the bedroom was. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the walls seemed thin, like they might barely hold back the forest outside. I unpacked quietly, set out my things, and started a fire in the fireplace to warm the place. The wood was dry, stacked neatly nearby, and the flames soon licked the dark corners of the room, pushing back shadows that seemed to creep closer when the fire was low. I felt good about the solitude. The first night, I slept with the windows slightly open, letting the cool air in, breathing in the smell of the forest. But the woods didn't stay quiet for long. Around midnight, I woke to a sharp noise outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a branch breaking, maybe a deer moving through the underbrush. The forest was alive after all, but something felt off. The noise was too deliberate, too close. My heart started to beat faster. I strained my ears in the dark, trying to catch any other sound. But there was only silence beyond the cabin walls. The fire had died down to glowing embers. I stayed awake for a while, listening. Then, faint but clear, came a rustling. Not the soft shuffle of small animals or the scurry of squirrels. This was heavier, deliberate. Something or someone moving through the leaves with purpose. I was alone out here. At least I was supposed to be. The next morning, the sun came up slow and pale, filtering weakly through the thick canopy. I checked around the cabin perimeter and found broken branches scattered about. Footprints in the soft earth near the back porch that didn't match mine or any animal I knew. They were too big for a deer or raccoon, but too muddy and indistinct to be sure of much else. Something had been here last night, close enough to the cabin to leave signs. I told myself it was probably a hunter or some local who didn't expect anyone here. Despite the unease, I stayed. I made coffee on the stove, then headed down the narrow dirt road to the lake. It was quiet and beautiful in the morning light, the water dark and still except for the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. The woods surrounded it in a thick green wall. I sat on a rock near the edge and breathed deeply, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. That day, I explored the nearby trails. The forest was dense, full of tangled branches and thorny bushes. I kept finding broken twigs and fresh animal tracks everywhere, but no signs of other people. I kept my phone close, though I knew I wouldn't get a signal here, just for the comfort of it. Back at the cabin that night, I made a bigger fire. I layered the wood carefully, making sure it wouldn't go out early this time. The cold seeped in, and the windows rattled softly in the wind that had picked up. I settled in with a book, but I could barely focus. Every crack or pop from the wood made me jump. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. Then, around 11 p.m., the noises started again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps or rustling leaves. There was a scraping sound, like metal dragged across stone. It echoed in the forest and made my skin crawl. I went to the window quietly, trying to peer out without being seen. The firelight cast long shadows, but the darkness beyond was impenetrable. For a few minutes, the scraping continued, Steady, slow, close by. Then, footsteps again, this time many. Heavy, thudding, walking in a circle around the cabin. The sound made my heart pound so hard I thought it might burst. I grabbed the biggest knife I had packed, a hunting knife with a wooden handle, and crept to the door. The lock was old and flimsy, but I slid the bolt shut. I checked all the windows and locked them as well, then moved the table in front of the door just in case. My hands trembled. I was not a brave person, but the primal urge to protect myself kicked in strong. I sat near the fire, knife in hand, eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the window. Eventually, the sounds stopped. The forest went quiet again. But I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found the table moved slightly. Not much, just enough that someone had pushed on it, maybe testing the barrier. On the porch, there were scuff marks, like someone had tried to force the door open. I felt violated. I was supposed to be alone here, safe. Still, I stayed. I told myself it was a local who thought the cabin was empty, or maybe some kids messing around. I had no proof of anything worse, but the fear was gnawing at me. I packed a small bag that day, including the knife, a flashlight, some food, and water. I wanted to explore further into the woods, see if I could find a trail back to the main road without using the dirt track. I needed to know if I could get out fast if things got worse. The forest seemed alive with sound that day. Birds, rustling leaves, the crack of twigs underfoot. But something else lurked beneath. The feeling of being followed or watched never left. Every time I stopped to rest, I scanned the trees, looking for movement. I saw nothing, but my skin crawled anyway. Late afternoon, as I was heading back to the cabin, the light faded quickly. The sky was overcast, and the woods closed in dark and cold. I felt the weight of the trees pressing down, like the forest was swallowing me whole. When I arrived back at the cabin, the door was wide open. My blood ran cold. I hadn't left it open. I was sure of it. I stepped inside slowly, knife raised. The room was empty. Nothing was missing, but everything felt wrong. The fire had been put out, the ashes cold and scattered. On the floor near the window was a strange symbol scratched into the wood. Just a rough circle with lines through it, like someone had drawn it with a knife or a sharp stone. I didn't recognize it, but it sent a chill through me. I locked the door and windows again, pushed the table in front of the door, and sat by the fire. I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I watched the shadows in the dark, waiting. The next day, I found tire tracks on the dirt road leading to the cabin, fresh and deep. They didn't belong to my Jeep. Someone had driven up here, came close to the cabin, then left. I didn't see footprints on the ground around the cabin, which meant whoever it was didn't get out of their vehicle much or at all. It was clear now, I was not alone in these woods, and whoever was here was watching. That night, the noises were worse. The footsteps around the cabin were heavy and many, circling slowly, sometimes stopping and starting. There were scraping sounds again, and once, a sharp knock on the door, hard, deliberate. I didn't answer. I stayed silent, barely breathing, knife clenched in my hand. The fire was low. My mind raced with everything I'd seen and heard. I thought about the roads, the tracks, the open door, the symbol scratched into the floor. Who was this person or people? What did they want? Why come out here, deep in the woods, to scare me? The next morning, I didn't hesitate. I packed everything I had and left the cabin without looking back. The Jeep started right up, and I drove back down the dirt road, feeling eyes on me the whole way. The forest behind me looked dark and silent, but I knew it was hiding something. Back in town, I reported the situation to the local sheriff. He listened, asked a few questions, and said the area was known for hunters and sometimes trespassers, but no one had reported anything violent recently. He advised me not to go back alone, which I agreed with. In the days that followed, I kept thinking about the cabin, the open door, the symbol on the floor. I researched symbols used by different groups, but found nothing that matched exactly. It felt like a warning or a mark of possession. I never found out who had been watching me, but I learned one thing clearly. Out in the wilderness, never thought that a simple weekend getaway in a remote cabin could turn into one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. I want to tell it all clearly, with every detail I can remember, because it stayed with me. Not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of how real it all felt. How close something dangerous and unknowable can get, and how helpless you feel when you are truly alone. It all started with a plan to get away from the city for a couple of days. I work a stressful job in the middle of a busy town, and the noise, the people, the constant demands were wearing me down. I needed silence, fresh air, and a break from everything. I found a cabin for rent about 3 hours away from where I live. It was deep in the woods, miles off the nearest paved road. The pictures looked inviting enough. A small wooden cabin nestled among tall pine trees, a creek nearby, and no neighbors for miles. The owner's description said it was completely off-grid, with no electricity or internet, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed my car carefully, a tent and sleeping bag just in case, a small gas stove, canned food, bottled water, some matches, a flashlight, and extra batteries. I told myself to keep things simple.
No distractions, no noise.
Just me and the woods. The drive was long but peaceful. As I left the highway and took the narrow dirt road, the trees grew thicker and taller, the sky disappearing behind a thick green canopy. Eventually, the dirt road gave way to a rough track barely wide enough for one car. I slowed down, my heart beating a little faster with every mile deeper into the forest. After nearly an hour on that track, I finally saw the cabin. It looked even smaller in person, a one-room log cabin, a small porch with a couple of old wooden chairs. Smoke was rising from the stone chimney, and a stack of firewood was neatly piled beside the door. The place was quiet except for the faint sound of the creek running nearby. I got out of the car and took a deep breath. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. It was exactly what I needed. I unlocked the door with the key the owner had left for me, stepped inside, and immediately felt the chill of the cool, shadowy interior. The cabin was simple but cozy. A small wood stove in one corner, a wooden table and 2 chairs, a bed covered with a thick wool blanket, and some basic kitchen utensils hanging on the wall. I set my backpack down and started unpacking. First thing, I went outside to gather some dry kindling for the fire. The sun was starting to drop behind the trees, so I wanted to get a fire going before dark. I stacked the kindling and small logs in the stove, struck a match, and watched the flames flicker to life. I boiled some water on the stove for coffee, drank it slowly while looking out the window at the darkening woods. The quiet was almost too much.
No cars, no planes, no voices.
Just the occasional bird call and the soft rush of the creek. As night fell, I stepped outside again and sat on the porch with my flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. The sky was clear, and stars were scattered like dust overhead. It was beautiful, but also made me feel small and alone. Inside the cabin, I prepared a simple meal, canned beans heated over the stove, and ate while reading a book by the weak light of a battery-powered lantern. I kept the door locked, just out of habit, though I told myself the forest was safe enough. I wasn't worried about bears or wolves. I had read that this area was mostly quiet at night, no large predators close by. After eating, I cleaned up, brushed my teeth with the water I had, and climbed into bed. The wool blanket was thick and warm, but the cabin felt cold despite the stove. I kept the fire burning low, just enough to keep the chill away. At first, I was calm. The silence was soothing. I could hear the creek bubbling near the cabin, the wind rustling the pine needles, and the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. I thought about how rare it was for me to be in a place so removed from everything. But as the night deepened, I started to notice other sounds. Small ones at first, barely perceptible. A faint scraping noise coming from the porch. A rustle in the bushes just beyond the window. At first, I told myself it was just a squirrel or a bird. The forest was alive after all. Then came the soft thud. Something heavy falling somewhere behind the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't natural either. Something solid dropping against the ground. I sat up in bed and held my breath, listening carefully. My heart beat faster. The sound didn't come again, but now I was alert. I reached for my flashlight and quietly got out of bed. I kept the wood stove fire low so I wouldn't draw too much attention. I grabbed the flashlight and the small folding knife I always kept in my pocket when outdoors, just for safety. I stepped out onto the porch. The night was cold, the air crisp. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the ground near the base of the porch. There was nothing there but fallen pine needles and a few scattered leaves. I scanned the surrounding woods carefully. The trees loomed tall and silent, the darkness swallowing everything beyond the reach of the light. The creek sound was still there, steady and calming, but the forest felt different now, heavier, like it was watching me. I walked slowly around the cabin, flashlight in hand, looking for anything unusual. I found a few animal tracks, deer probably, but nothing alarming. The thud I had heard could have been a branch falling or a rock tumbling down a slope. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I went back inside and locked the door again. I kept the knife nearby on the table and tried to calm my nerves. I sat down, turned on the lantern, and waited. The night felt long. Every little noise made me jump. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. My mind kept replaying that strange noise and other little sounds I heard but couldn't identify. Somewhere outside, I heard what sounded like heavy breathing or panting. It was too low to be human, but too steady to be a random animal. I strained to listen, but the darkness outside was impenetrable. Suddenly, I heard a scratching at the door. Soft, slow, deliberate, like someone or something was scraping their nails or claws against the wood. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I gripped the knife tighter. The scratching stopped. Then, after a pause, it started again. Louder, more urgent. I stood up, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other, and slowly moved toward the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I looked out the small window in the door. The beam of the flashlight swept the porch, but there was nothing there. No person, no animal, just the empty wood and the dark trees beyond. I opened the door a crack, enough to peek outside. The porch was empty, but I saw something on the ground. A small, round stone. I hadn't noticed it before. The stone looked smooth and wet, like it had been placed there recently. I picked it up, feeling a chill run through me. Then I noticed something strange. The stone was warm, warmer than it should have been in the cold night air. It felt almost like it had been in someone's hand moments ago. I closed the door quickly and locked it. My mind raced. Who could have been there? There was no car, no footprints. The dirt track was miles away. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile through dense woods. No one was supposed to be here. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, knife close, flashlight on. Every sound made me jump. I didn't dare open the door again. Morning came slowly. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. I was exhausted but relieved to see daylight. Outside, I walked cautiously around the cabin again. I looked for footprints or signs of someone else, but there was nothing. No tire tracks on the dirt road, no human prints on the soft earth or porch steps. The stone from the night before was gone. I packed my things quickly, feeling uneasy now. I had wanted peace and quiet, but I felt like I had been watched or followed. Something was wrong here. I locked up the cabin and started my car. As I drove back down the dirt road toward the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had been there with me. I never went back to that cabin. Weeks later, I looked up information about the area. I found some local reports of break-ins and thefts targeting remote cabins like the one I had rented. Some locals warned that people sometimes used these places as hideouts or traps to catch hunters and travelers off guard. I realized then what probably happened. Someone had been nearby that night, watching. Maybe they had been hiding in the woods, waiting for me to show up. The strange noises, the thud, the scratching on the door. It was someone testing the cabin's defenses, trying to scare me or see if I was alone. The warm stone was likely a way to prove they had been close, to mess with my head. I hadn't been dealing with ghosts or legends. I had been face to face with a person who wanted to scare me, maybe rob me or worse. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it. How easy it is to feel safe until you realize you're not. I didn't mean for it to become a nightmare. It started out as a simple plan. A weekend away in a remote cabin to disconnect from the city and clear my head. I'd been working nonstop for months, the pressure building until it felt like my chest might crack open. I needed silence, solitude, something different. The cabin was supposed to be just that. A small wooden structure nestled deep in the woods, far from any road or other people. No cell service, no internet, no noise except the wind through the trees. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, late May, just as the sun was starting to sink. The drive had been long, nearly 3 hours down twisting gravel roads, but the last stretch was a single narrow lane that disappeared between thick pines. The forest grew denser the closer I got, branches arching overhead, sunlight thinning out under the high canopy. I'd picked the cabin through an online listing. It was a private rental, with only a few basic reviews, nothing too polished or touristy. That was part of the appeal. Something raw, something real. When I pulled up, the cabin sat alone in a small clearing. It was rustic, smaller than I expected, with faded wood siding weathered gray by years of rain and sun. A chimney rose crookedly from the roof. The porch was sagging, its boards cracked and uneven. The windows were dusty but intact. Around the cabin, wild grass and bushes crowded in close, and I noticed a few scattered logs piled near the side, probably for firewood. The silence hit me immediately. No birds chirping, no distant cars, no airplanes. Just the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of insects waking up as evening approached. Felt like the world was holding its breath. I unloaded my backpack and groceries, setting my things inside. The cabin's interior was small but functional. A single room with a stone fireplace on one wall, a tiny kitchenette with an old stove, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft above. The loft had a thin mattress, blankets, and a small window facing the woods. The cabin smelled like damp wood and dust, the floorboards creaking underfoot. I started a fire in the fireplace. The wood was dry enough, but it took a few tries to get a good blaze going. I cooked some canned soup on the stove and sat down near the fire, staring into the flames as the sky outside deepened to twilight. For the first time in weeks, I felt a little peace. Night came quickly. The forest outside went black, the only light coming from the fire and a small oil lamp I'd brought. I lay down on the loft mattress, pulling a blanket over me. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and I heard the soft thump of a branch falling somewhere nearby. It was a good night for sleeping, I thought, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing noises, small at first. A rustle just beyond the window, a faint scratching sound against the cabin's exterior. I told myself it was animals, maybe squirrels or raccoons moving through the brush, but the sounds grew louder, sharper. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, just outside the cabin, right beneath the window. I froze, heart pounding, straining to listen. But when I looked, nothing was there. I tried to calm myself. The woods were full of life, and these things were normal, I told myself. I wasn't imagining it, though. Something didn't feel right. The silence felt too heavy, like it was hiding something. Around midnight, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and shaking the walls. The fire sputtered, casting flickering shadows on the ceiling. I wrapped the blanket tighter and closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. But then I heard it. A sharp, thudding noise, like heavy boots stomping on dry leaves, circling the cabin slowly, moving back and forth just outside. The steps weren't random. They followed a pattern, pacing carefully, deliberate, and methodical. I lay perfectly still, every muscle tense, listening. Then, from somewhere just beyond the porch, came a low scraping sound, like something dragging along the wooden floorboards. It stopped abruptly, and silence fell again, thick and suffocating. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I was paralyzed. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps receded slowly, moving back into the forest. I waited, frozen, until the sounds finally vanished. At dawn, I crept down from the loft, the floorboards groaning under my weight. Outside, the forest was bathed in soft morning light. I walked cautiously around the cabin, looking for any signs of disturbance. That's when I saw it. Deep scratches along the porch railing, jagged and uneven, as if something large had clawed at the wood. There were footprints in the soft earth near the cabin, heavy, boot-like prints that circled the clearing. They were too big to be mine or any normal animal. My stomach sank. I checked the windows and doors again, making sure everything was locked. The door latch was intact, but the scratches on the wood told me someone had tried to force their way in. I didn't know what to think. Who could have been outside? The cabin was supposed to be isolated. I had told no one where I was coming, and I hadn't seen any other cars or people on the way in. That day, I stayed inside, pacing and checking the windows repeatedly. The sun was warm and bright, but the forest seemed quieter than before, like the life had been drained out of it overnight. I didn't dare venture far from the cabin. That evening, as dusk fell again, the noises started up once more. Footsteps circling the cabin, scraping sounds on the porch, rustling in the bushes. I tried to keep the fire going, piling on wood to keep the light and heat strong. I sat close to the flames, clutching a small hatchet I'd brought along, just in case. Hours passed. The footsteps came closer and closer, the scratching louder, almost frantic. At one point, I heard a sharp bang against the cabin wall, heavy, like a fist pounding on wood. My heart nearly stopped. I was trapped in the cabin, surrounded by darkness and whatever was outside, waiting, watching. The fire died down to embers, and the lamp flickered low. My hands trembled as I gripped the hatchet, eyes darting to every shadow. Then, just before dawn, everything stopped. Silence fell like a weight.
No footsteps, no scrapping, no rustling.
The forest outside seemed to hold its breath again. When the sun finally rose, I didn't wait. I packed up as quickly as I could, grabbing the essentials and leaving most behind. I locked the door, shoved the key under a rock by the porch. Not that I planned to come back anytime soon. The drive out of the forest was tense. I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a car following me or headlights in the distance. But there was nothing. I don't know what happened that weekend. Was it someone stalking me? A stranger living rough in the woods? Hunters? I never saw anyone, but the signs were clear. Someone had been there, lurking just beyond the cabin, close enough to scare me half to death. The worst part was the feeling that I was being watched the entire time. Like the forest wasn't just trees and animals, but something else, something patient and calculating. Since then, I've never gone back to that cabin or anywhere that remote alone. I tell myself it was just a one-time thing, bad luck, maybe a group of hunters or drifters passing through. But every time I close my eyes, I can still hear those footsteps circling, scraping, waiting in the dark. And that's a sound I don't think I'll ever forget. The story above is about 1,100 words. You requested about 5,000 words in one go, so I will continue expanding the story, going deeper into details about the environment, the characters' thoughts, the preparations, the surroundings, and the chilling events, all while maintaining a realistic tone. After the first night, I stayed up most of the second day trying to piece together what had happened. The forest around the cabin was dense. Towering pines, thick underbrush, and moss-covered rocks. I had spent the afternoon walking a small radius, hoping to find a trail or any sign of who might have been nearby, but found only more animal tracks and broken twigs. The undergrowth was so thick it was hard to move quietly without snapping branches underfoot. The woods smelled of damp earth, pine resin, and something faintly sour I couldn't identify. Sunlight filtered down in green gold beams, illuminating patches of wildflowers and clusters of ferns. Despite the beauty, I couldn't shake the unease that hung over the place. When I returned to the cabin, I spent time examining the scratches and marks on the porch. They were deep, claw-like, but the spacing was irregular, more like someone struggling to gain grip or frantically scratching to get in. The footprints outside were heavy and distinct, too large and deep to be mine, and they didn't resemble any animal prints I recognized. I looked for broken twigs or disturbed earth beyond the footprints, but found none. Whoever had been there had been careful, maybe trying not to leave a trace beyond the immediate clearing. That night, I barricaded the door as best I could, sliding a heavy log across the wooden floorboards inside to jam the latch. I stacked I didn't plan to be scared that night. I went out to the cabin in the woods because I needed a break. A real break from the city, from work, and from the endless noise of everyday life. I'd spent years working behind a desk, staring at screens, and feeling more and more trapped by the city's constant buzz. The quiet was what I needed. I wanted to get away, breathe fresh air, and clear my head. I didn't expect anything to go wrong. The cabin was nothing fancy. It was a small, weathered wooden structure that sat deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The owner was an old friend who had lent it to me for a week, saying it was a good place to get away from everything. The road was rough and narrow, a gravel track that wound through the trees for several miles. The last mile, I had to park the car and walk because the road turned into a trail too narrow and rough for any vehicle. When I first stepped inside, the air was thick with the smell of pine and damp wood. The floor creaked underfoot, and the walls showed the cracks and marks of years of weather. The cabin was a single room with a small wood stove, a rough wooden table, a couple of chairs, a bed with a thin mattress, and a tiny kitchen area with a sink and an old gas stove. The windows were small and grimy, letting in just enough light to see the dense forest pressing close outside. I set down my backpack and lit the stove. The cabin was cold, and the fire was the only thing keeping the air from feeling damp and heavy. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. I had brought food, water, and basic supplies, planning to spend the night and maybe two if I felt up to it. I didn't bring a phone, or at least I had no signal. The idea was to disconnect completely.
No messages, no emails, no distractions.
As the night grew darker, the sounds of the woods changed. The birds went silent, replaced by the soft rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. The wind stirred the trees, making branches scrape against the cabin's wooden walls. I sat near the stove, wrapped in a blanket, sipping hot tea from a metal cup. The warmth was comforting, but the silence was deeper than I had expected. It wasn't peaceful in the way I thought it would be. It felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. That was when I first noticed the noises. At first, it was just a soft thud outside the cabin. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon, maybe. The forest was full of wildlife, after all. Then came another noise, a sharp snap of a twig, closer this time. My heart beat a little faster. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was safe inside, and the walls would keep me safe. But the noises kept coming slow, deliberate sounds outside the cabin, footsteps crunching on the dry leaves and twigs. They didn't sound like the quick, skittish movements of an animal. They were too steady, too slow. Something was moving just beyond the windows, pacing the cabin. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and moved closer to the stove. The fire's warmth wasn't enough to chase away the chill crawling up my spine. I didn't have a weapon, not even a knife. My backpack was by the door, where I had dropped it after arriving. I considered grabbing it, but it felt too far away. Minutes passed like hours. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound at all. Then came the scratching. It was faint at first, like someone dragging a branch across the wood. It moved along the side of the cabin, slow and methodical. The scratching circled around the building, coming closer to the front door. I could see the shadow of a branch scraping the window, leaving a faint mark on the glass. I realized with a sudden, sick feeling that I wasn't alone in the woods. I wanted to call for help, but I had no signal, and I had told no one where I was. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and at night, no one would be driving those roads. My mind raced through every possible explanation. A lost hunter? Someone playing a prank? A wild animal clawing at the cabin? None of it made sense. The sounds were too human, too purposeful. They weren't just random noises. The fire in the stove flickered, and I grabbed a nearby poker, an iron rod used to push logs inside the stove. It was my only defense. I moved slowly to the window, trying to look outside without being seen. The woods were pitch black except for the faint light of the fire shining through the cabin windows. Then I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the tree line. It didn't move much, just watched the cabin. It was hard to see details. It wore dark clothes that blended into the night. No face was visible. It didn't run away or approach. It just stood there, waiting. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. I thought about running, but the door was between me and the figure, and outside was nothing but trees and shadows. I stayed near the stove, holding the poker tightly. The figure stayed motionless for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, it vanished. No sound, no footsteps, just gone. I sat frozen for a long time after that, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The woods were quiet again, the normal sounds of the night returning. I stayed awake until dawn, fire burning low in the stove, every noise making me jump. When the first light of morning finally filtered through the windows, I grabbed my backpack and didn't hesitate. I didn't stay to pack or clean up. I ran through the woods, careful not to make noise, following the trail back to my car. When I reached the road, I locked the doors and started the engine without looking back. Days later, I learned there had been reports of a missing person in the area, someone last seen near that forest. The police suspected foul play but had no leads. I never told anyone about the figure I saw. I didn't want to get involved or be seen as crazy. But sometimes, when the wind rustles the trees, I think about that night and the silent figure waiting just beyond the cabin walls. It wasn't ghosts or legends. It was something real, something dangerous, and I still don't know what it wanted. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend alone, a chance to get away from the constant noise of the city and the endless demands of work. I'd found this old cabin for rent, far off the main roads, deep in the woods of the Appalachian Mountains. The listing made it sound peaceful, a rustic, weathered cabin with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom. No internet, no cell signal, just pure isolation. I packed my car the night before and left early Friday morning, hoping to reach the cabin before dark. The drive was long, twisting through narrow mountain roads flanked by towering pine trees. Eventually, the asphalt ran out, and I bounced over gravel and dirt for miles until the GPS gave up entirely. I had to rely on the map I'd printed out and the sun's position to guide me. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, the smell of pine and damp earth thick in the air. It looked exactly like the photos. Old but sturdy, with faded red paint peeling off the wooden walls and a stone chimney that looked like it hadn't seen a fire in years. I pulled up, turned off the engine, and stepped out. The silence hit me immediately. No birds, no distant sounds of cars or people, just an overwhelming stillness. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the cabin was cold and smelled of dust and old wood. The floor creaked underfoot, and spider webs hung from the corners of the ceiling. There was a fireplace, an old metal wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen with a sink that didn't work. The bedroom was tiny, with a single bed and a thin mattress. I unpacked my gear and started a fire in the wood stove. The flames struggled at first but eventually took hold, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The first night was surprisingly difficult. The silence was so complete that every little noise inside the cabin seemed amplified. The creak of the wood settling, the whistle of the wind through the cracks in the window frames, the distant snap of a branch outside. I felt exposed, like the forest was pressing in on me from all sides. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling as the fire dwindled down to embers. The darkness felt almost physical, like a heavy blanket smothering the room. My imagination tried to fill the void with thoughts, but I forced myself to think about practical things. The route I'd take hiking tomorrow, the supplies I had, the work I needed to catch up on. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a low thud, like something heavy hitting the ground outside. My heart jumped. I sat up, straining to listen. The noise repeated, soft footsteps crunching on dead leaves, coming from the edge of the clearing near the woods. I convinced myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. I woke early, the sun filtering weakly through grimy windows. The cold air bit into my skin as I opened the door to step outside. The forest was dense, trees crowding the clearing on every side. The ground was littered with leaves and broken branches. I walked around the cabin, searching for any sign of what had made the noise. There were footprints in the soft dirt near the edge of the clearing. Definitely not animal tracks. They looked like boot prints, but they were old, probably from a few days ago. Someone had been here. The thought unsettled me. Why would anyone come out this far? The cabin was supposed to be isolated. I tried not to dwell on it. Maybe it was hunters or hikers passing through. That night, the sounds outside returned, louder and closer. I sat by the dying fire, heart pounding as I heard heavy footsteps circling the cabin. The branches snapped under weight, and the gravel crunched just beyond the window. I didn't sleep well. Every time I drifted off, a noise would jerk me awake. A scraping sound on the cabin's wooden walls, a soft thump against the door. My mind raced, imagining all the worst scenarios. I stayed up as long as I could, clutching a hunting knife I'd brought, just in case. The fire eventually died, leaving me in near-total darkness except for the faint moonlight outside. I left the cabin early and decided to hike down the forest path the rental owner had mentioned. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but it seemed to lead toward a logging road a few miles away. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. The forest was alive with noise now. Birds calling, insects buzzing, but something felt off. Every now and then, I thought I'd catch movement in the underbrush, just beyond clear sight. Halfway through the hike, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tucked behind a fallen log was an old backpack, weathered and covered in dirt and leaves. I opened it carefully. Inside were a few empty water bottles, some canned food long past expiration, and a notebook filled with scrawled writing. I flipped through the pages. The handwriting was shaky, the words frantic. It was clear whoever owned this bag had been out here alone for days. The last entries talked about hearing footsteps at night, shadows watching from the trees, and the overwhelming fear of being followed. I hurried back before dark, my mind racing with the realization that I might not be alone out here. Someone else was or had been close enough to leave those footprints and the abandoned backpack. That night, I kept every light in the cabin on. I set the knife by the door and arranged the furniture so I could see all the windows from my bed. The sounds outside started again. Heavy footsteps, soft scraping, something brushing against the walls. Around midnight, I heard something slam against the back door. I froze, breath caught in my throat. The sound came again, louder, more deliberate, like someone testing the door. I crept to the window and peered outside. The clearing was empty. No sign of movement. I checked every door and window, all locked. The pounding stopped, but I couldn't sleep. The noise escalated. This time, footsteps circled the cabin, followed by long dragging sounds as if something heavy was being pulled through the leaves. I heard muffled banging on the walls and doors, like someone trying to force entry. I stayed quiet and motionless, waiting until the noises faded into the night. In the morning, I found deep gouges in the wood near the back door, claw marks or something sharp scraped into the frame. I realized I was trapped, or at least vulnerable. I decided I couldn't stay the night again. The sounds, the footprints, the signs of someone nearby, it wasn't just animals or hikers. Something was wrong. I gathered my things quickly, loading the car in the dim morning light. I packed the knife in my pocket, my heart thudding in my chest as I locked the cabin door behind me. I had to find the logging road and get to a place with cell service. The trail to the logging road was longer and rougher than I expected. My boots sank into mud in places, and the forest grew thicker. I moved fast, not daring to stop. About halfway there, I heard it again. Footsteps, distant but definitely human, moving quickly through the woods behind me. I didn't dare look back. I broke into a run, heart hammering, lungs burning. The footsteps followed, sometimes speeding up, sometimes falling silent. I pushed harder, desperate to reach the road. When I finally burst out onto the logging road, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. I looked both ways. The road was empty, silent except for birds and the rustle of wind in the trees. I pulled out my phone, still no signal. I was deeper than I thought. I decided to follow the road downhill, hoping to reach a main highway. About an hour into walking the logging road, I saw something ahead. A man standing near an old pickup truck. He looked rough, clothes dirty and torn, unshaven, eyes scanning the woods. I approached cautiously, keeping my distance. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with a hard, unreadable expression. I sensed danger. Something about him was off. I moved around him and got back on the road, my pace quickening. After what felt like hours, the trees began to thin, and the sound of traffic grew. I finally reached a paved road with cars passing by. I stuck out my thumb until a truck stopped and took me to the nearest town. I called the rental owner, told him everything. He was shocked and said he hadn't heard about anyone else near the cabin recently. I reported the abandoned backpack and footprints to the ranger station. They launched a search but found no trace of anyone living in the woods. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was to get out when I did. The cabin was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, but instead, it felt like a trap. A place where someone had been watching, waiting, maybe even stalking. I never saw the person who was out there with me. Maybe they left the area after I left, or maybe they are still out there, living off the grid, hiding in the forest. The experience taught me that isolation can be dangerous not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of people. Real people with real intentions that can be terrifying. I'll never forget the cold nights, the footsteps circling, the feeling of eyes in the dark, and I'll never go back to that cabin again. I still remember the feeling of the cold air biting into my skin as I stepped out of my car and looked up at the small cabin sitting quietly at the edge of the dense woods. The place was tucked away from everything, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but tall trees and the silent shadows of the forest. I had rented the cabin for a week, hoping for some peace and quiet, a break from the endless noise and stress of city life. The drive had been long and tiring, winding through narrow roads covered in patches of gravel and fallen leaves. The further I got into the woods, the heavier the silence became. No radio signals, no cell service, just the crunch of tires on the dirt road. The cabin itself was small and rustic, made of old, weathered logs. The roof sagged in one corner and the windows were dusty, but it was solid and, on paper, perfect for a solo retreat. I dragged my bag inside and dropped it on the floor, taking a moment to breathe in the stillness. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The inside of the cabin was dark and smelled faintly of smoke and must, but it was dry and warm enough from the wood stove that someone had used recently. There was a simple kitchen area, a small table with 2 chairs, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft. A single bed was pushed against the far wall, covered in a threadbare blanket. I unpacked slowly, setting out a few essentials on the table: a bottle of water, some canned food, a flashlight, and my old camping knife. I come prepared for roughing it a little, but I expected it to be safe. At least that's what I told myself. That first night, the silence was overwhelming. No cars, no distant voices, just the natural sounds of the forest. The wind rustled the trees outside, and every now and then I heard the low hoot of an owl or the snap of a twig somewhere in the darkness. I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, my eyes adjusting to the pitch black. The cold crept under the door frame, and I pulled the blanket tighter around me. I had thought the quiet would be peaceful, but as the hours passed, it became unsettling. I kept hearing noises, distant footsteps on the dry leaves, a low rustling just beyond the window, something shifting near the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was nothing. Deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. But the noises didn't stop. They grew louder, more frequent, and then other sounds joined in: deep, heavy breathing like something big and slow moving. I wasn't afraid at first. I've spent enough nights camping alone in the wild to know how animals behave. But there was something different here, something wrong. The next morning, I found the front porch covered in broken branches and crushed leaves, like something large had been there overnight. No footprints, no clear sign of what made the mess, just the destruction. I went back inside and tried to focus on simple tasks: boiling water for coffee, organizing my things, checking the stove. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to explore the area around the cabin to clear my head. The woods stretched thick and dark in every direction. The trees were tall and close, their trunks covered in moss and thick vines. The ground was soft and uneven, scattered with fallen logs and dense underbrush. I walked slowly, watching for animals or any sign of people. The forest was quiet except for the occasional call of a bird or the distant babble of a creek. About a quarter-mile from the cabin, I found an old dirt road, barely visible under years of overgrowth. It looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. I followed it for a bit, curious, but it dead-ended at a rusted gate hanging off one hinge. Beyond the gate was more forest, thicker and darker. Something about the gate made me uneasy. I stood there for a moment, looking at the twisted metal and the overgrown path, and I felt a strange chill, like I'd crossed into a place that didn't want visitors. I took a picture with my phone before turning back. The signal was weak, but enough to save a photo. Back at the cabin, the unease didn't fade. I kept hearing noises at night, closer now, like something was pacing just outside. The wind died down, but the sounds continued. Heavy footsteps crunching leaves, low thumps against the walls, occasional scraping noises like claws on wood. I checked all the windows and doors repeatedly, making sure they were locked. The locks were old but sturdy. Still, the noises persisted. On the third night, something happened that made my blood run cold. I was lying in bed, eyes closed, trying to will myself to sleep, when I heard a loud bang on the front door. Not a knock, a hard slam. I froze. The cabin was small, and the sound echoed sharply inside. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly got up, moving toward the door with my knife in hand. The porch was empty. I shone the flashlight around. The beam cut through the dark like a knife, illuminating the empty clearing in front of the cabin. No footprints, no shadows, nothing. Just the quiet forest, like nothing had happened. I locked the door again and sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, my breath shaking. I stayed up the rest of the night, too scared to close my eyes. The next day, I found new signs of something having been outside. The side window had been scratched hard enough to crack the glass. Branches were snapped and piled near the back door, as if someone or something had been trying to break in. I took pictures, my hands trembling. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was still hours away. I had no car phone signal to call for help. The only way out was the same road I'd come in on. And besides, I didn't want to give in to fear. Instead, I made a plan. I moved my sleeping spot closer to the stove, where I could stay warm and have a better view out the windows. I stacked heavy logs around the door and windows, something to slow down whoever or whatever was out there. That night, the noises came back worse than before. Heavy footsteps paced the perimeter, scraping noises dragged against the walls. I heard breathing, low and ragged, right outside the cabin. I held my knife tightly, ready for whatever might happen. The night felt endless. At some point, I think I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is waking to silence and pale light seeping through the window. I looked outside and saw no sign of anything. No broken branches, no footprints, no shadows. I was exhausted but relieved to have made it through the night. The next morning, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I packed quickly and checked the cabin one last time. As I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. Near the back door, partially hidden under a pile of leaves, was a scrap of torn cloth. It looked old and dirty, but the fabric was thick, like from a jacket or heavy shirt. I picked it up carefully and stuffed it in my bag. The hike back to my car was tense. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was no one. The forest was quiet, too quiet. When I finally saw my car, relief washed over me. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. Driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the cabin disappearing into the trees. The silence of the woods stayed with me, but I knew I was safe now. Later, when I was back home, I took the cloth scrap to a local expert in outdoor gear. He told me it was from a thick work jacket, something worn by hunters or loggers. That made sense. The area had a history of logging and occasional illegal hunting. Still, the question haunted me. Who or what had been outside the cabin? Why did it come so close? And why had it tried so hard to scare me away? I never found out for sure. The police told me there had been reports of trespassers and poachers in that forest area before, sometimes violent. They suggested that what I experienced might have been an encounter with someone wanting to protect their territory or keep people away. I never went back to that cabin. The memory of those nights, the sounds, the feeling of being watched and hunted, stayed with me for a long time. Even now, years later, I think about how close I came to something dangerous, something real and human, not made up or imagined. The woods aren't just quiet and peaceful. Sometimes they hide things you don't want to meet. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't a ghost or monster. It's just a person, alone and desperate, willing to do anything to protect what's theirs. I've always liked the quiet, the kind of quiet you get deep in the woods where the nearest house is miles away, and the only sounds are the wind in the trees or the crackle of a fire. For years, I've been escaping to cabins, small, simple places far from the noise of towns and cities. This time, I thought, would be no different. Just me, a few days alone, some books, and the smell of pine. The cabin was tucked away in a thick forest, about 2 hours from the nearest town. I had driven down a rough dirt road that narrowed the further I went until I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat. It was old, but sturdy, weathered wood, a stone chimney, and a porch that creaked with every step. The kind of place where, if you didn't know better, you might think it had been abandoned for years. But it wasn't. I had rented it through a small local service that managed a handful of these cabins for people wanting to get away. The owner wasn't around.
No caretaker.
Just a key in a lockbox and a small booklet with instructions. The first day was perfect. I unpacked my stuff, made a fire in the stone ring outside, and cooked some simple food. The sun was warm, the air smelled fresh, and everything felt normal. I walked around the edge of the clearing, took pictures of the trees, the moss, the small creek that ran nearby. Nothing felt out of place. That night, after the fire died down, I went inside. The cabin was small. A main room with a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a couch. A small kitchen area with a sink and some shelves. 2 bedrooms with creaky beds and thin blankets. A bathroom with a tiny shower. No internet, no phone signal, and no electricity except what the owner supplied with a generator that I had to start by hand. The lights worked, but only for a few hours before the fuel ran out. I figured that was fine. I didn't need much. I read by flashlight for a while, then went to bed early. The silence was thick. No cars, no planes, no city noise. Just the sounds of the forest. Crickets, owls, the occasional rustle of a small animal. I liked that kind of quiet, felt safe. But that night, something changed. I woke up around 2 a.m., not sure why. The air inside the cabin felt colder than before. I sat up, and for a moment, I thought I heard something outside. A soft scraping noise, like branches brushing against the cabin walls. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe a raccoon looking for food. I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep, but the noises kept coming. Soft, irregular, scraping sounds on the outside of the cabin. I got up quietly and went to the window. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the trees. I strained my eyes, looking into the dark forest around the clearing. First, I saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the clearing, I caught a glimpse of movement. Something small, maybe a deer, moving quickly between the trees. The scraping sounds stopped. I went back to bed, but my heart was pounding. I didn't like the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I told myself it was just nerves. I was alone in the woods, and my brain was playing tricks on me. I spent the day hiking nearby, making sure to stay on marked trails, checking out a small waterfall about a mile away. The air was fresh, the sun warm, and by evening, I was tired enough to forget the night's noises. That night, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked tight. I double-checked the porch lights and left a small knife on the table near my bed. I told myself I was being silly, but I wanted to feel prepared. Around midnight, I woke up again. This time, the scraping sounds were louder and closer. It wasn't random anymore. It sounded deliberate. Something was moving along the side of the cabin, touching the walls, brushing branches, maybe even trying to get inside. I lay frozen, listening. The silence between the sounds was worse than the noise itself. My mind started running through every possible explanation. Animals, hunters, pranksters, or worse. I wanted to call someone, but there was no signal. I considered leaving the cabin, but the woods were dark and unfamiliar. And if someone was out there, I didn't want to meet them on the path. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. Then I heard a faint crunching on the gravel driveway leading to the cabin. I grabbed the knife and slowly got out of bed. The cold floor felt like ice under my bare feet. I moved to the window again, flashlight in hand, shining it out into the night. Nothing. No movement, no figures, just trees swaying in the wind. I was about to lower the flashlight when I noticed something lying on the ground near the porch steps. I grabbed my coat and went outside carefully, stepping over broken twigs and dry leaves. The air was thick and cold, and my breath came out in white puffs. When I reached the porch, I saw what was on the ground. A worn leather glove, dirty and wet. It wasn't mine. I hadn't brought gloves with me. I picked it up and looked around. No footprints in the gravel. No sign of anything else. I took the glove inside and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found more signs that someone had been near the cabin. A fresh cigarette, but in the dirt near the fire ring. A crushed soda can tossed behind the bushes. The glove was soaked in mud, the inside worn thin. I had no idea who could have left those things. The nearest road was miles away, and the cabin was supposed to be private. I started checking the cabin for other signs. The back door, a simple wooden door with a rusty lock, was locked tight. No sign of forced entry. Windows had no broken glass. Nothing inside was missing or moved, but the feeling of safety was gone. I considered leaving, maybe cut the trip short, but I had already driven so far, and the nearest town was over an hour away. That afternoon, I decided to hike back to the road to check if anyone was nearby or if I could spot a car. I packed some water and a small snack and set out. The trail was narrow and winding. After about 20 minutes, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, steady, not like mine. I stopped and waited, but no one came into view. I kept walking, heart beating faster. Suddenly, a figure appeared through the trees a few hundred feet behind me. A man wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He didn't look like a hunter, no gear, no rifle, just walking. I stepped aside, hoping he would keep going, but he stopped and looked at me. His face was hard to see in the shade, but I could tell he was watching me carefully. I said nothing and kept walking toward the road. He followed. Panic started to build. I broke into a run. When I reached the road, I saw a car parked a little ways down, engine running. The man stopped at the tree line and didn't come closer. I flagged the car down. The driver, a woman about my age, rolled down the window and looked surprised. I asked if she had seen anyone else on the trail. She shook her head and said no. I told her about the man following me. She said she would call the sheriff and offered to drive me back to the cabin. I agreed. On the way back, the woman told me the area had a few issues with trespassers and some recent reports of people sneaking into cabins to steal or cause trouble. No arrests yet, but they were watching. When we got back, the woman waited in her car while I checked the cabin again. Everything looked normal, but as I went to close the back door, I saw a small hole in the screen window next to it. It looked fresh. Someone had tried to cut through. I showed it to the woman. She radioed her partner and told me to stay in the car while they searched the area. They found no one, but the feeling that I was being watched didn't go away. I stayed awake the rest of that night with the doors locked and the lights on, but I heard nothing more. The next day, I packed my things and left. Driving away, I looked back at the cabin, the trees, the clearing. I realized that the woods, no matter how quiet or peaceful they seem, can hide dangers far worse than any ghost story. Real dangers, people, criminals, strangers who don't belong. That cabin wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by the fear of someone real, someone who had been watching me the whole time, someone who had tried to get inside. The silence I had loved had turned into a trap. I never went back. I never thought a simple weekend trip could turn into something so unsettling, something I'd carry with me years later. I've always been someone who liked the quiet, the calm of nature away from the city noise, the buzz of people. The idea was simple. Rent a small cabin deep in the woods, spend a few days alone with a stack of books, a fire pit, and some canned food. A break from the constant stress of work and life. The cabin was nothing fancy. It was an old wooden structure, a modest one-room building with a porch and a little dirt driveway barely visible beneath fallen leaves and pine needles. The kind of place you imagine from postcards or rustic calendars. It had no electricity, no running water, just an old wood stove and a well nearby, perfect for disconnecting. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The sky was cloudy, but the air still held a faint warmth from the late summer sun. As I pulled my car off the narrow dirt road, the gravel crunching under the tires, I could feel the silence wrap around me. It was thick, like a heavy blanket.
No cars, no planes o overhead, no voices.
Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of branches. The owner of the cabin left the key in a small metal box nailed to a tree near the driveway. I took it, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately. A mix of old wood, dust, and something damp that I couldn't quite place. The floor creaked underfoot, and dust motes floated lazily in the fading light coming through the windows. The walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper, and the single bed against the far wall was stripped bare except for a thin, worn blanket. I unpacked my bag, lit the small wood stove, and began to settle in. The fire caught easily, and soon the cabin was warm. I pulled my chair close, cracked open a book, and let the quiet seep into me. The first night passed without incident. The usual sounds of the forest were there, distant owls, rustling leaves, the chirping of crickets, but nothing out of the ordinary. I slept well, wrapped in the thin blanket, my breath visible in the chill air of the cabin. The next day was clear, with the sun breaking through the clouds. I spent most of the morning walking the narrow trails around the cabin, admiring the tall pines and dense underbrush. The forest was beautiful but also strangely isolating. The thick canopy blocked out most of the sky, and the trees stood so close together that even the light struggled to reach the ground. I found an old, collapsed fence line at the edge of the property, half hidden by vines and moss. A few rusty farm tools lay scattered nearby, forgotten relics of a life long gone. The deeper I walked into the woods, the more I felt the weight of solitude pressing down on me. There was no one else for miles. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin. The light was softer now, casting long shadows through the windows. I lit the stove again and prepared a simple meal. As the darkness outside thickened, I could hear the usual night noises start up. The hoot of an owl, the snap of twigs, the distant rustle of animals moving in the underbrush. It was then that the strange noises began. At first, it was a faint rustling, like branches brushing together or small animals moving through leaves. I told myself it was nothing, the usual forest sounds amplified by the silence. But then came the sounds I couldn't explain. A deep, guttural growl, low and slow, almost like an animal but heavier, closer, followed by a sharp, piercing scream that cut through the night like a knife. It wasn't human, not quite, but it carried a terrifying edge of desperation. I froze in my chair, every muscle tense, listening. The noises didn't last long but left a ringing in my ears. Then silence again. My heart was pounding, and the calm I'd felt all day was gone. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. There was no way someone could just walk up to the cabin unnoticed. The driveway was narrow and surrounded by thick forest, but the noises still unnerved me. I tried to read, tried to tell myself it was just a wild animal or some other natural sound, but sleep escaped me. The second night was worse. Around midnight, the sounds returned, louder and more frequent. There were footsteps outside, heavy, deliberate steps breaking branches and crunching leaves. The sounds circled the cabin, moving from one side to the other, then pausing in front of the door as if someone or something was watching. I stayed perfectly still, eyes wide open, barely daring to breathe. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending a chill through the room. The footsteps faded slowly, replaced by a low growl that echoed off the trees. I wasn't sure what I feared more, the possibility of a wild animal or a person with unknown intentions lurking outside. Either way, I felt trapped, vulnerable. When dawn finally broke, pale and gray through the small windows, I stood and stepped outside. The ground was littered with broken branches and disturbed leaves, signs of whatever had been there. I checked around the perimeter, but there was no clear trail or footprints. The dirt was dry and hard, making it hard to see tracks. I spent the day on edge, pacing inside the cabin, preparing for the next night. The isolation that had once seemed peaceful now felt suffocating, like the woods themselves were closing in. That evening, I decided to leave the cabin. I packed my bag quickly and grabbed my keys, determined to get back to my car and out of the forest. But as I stepped outside, I saw something that stopped me cold. On the porch railing, scratched deep into the weathered wood, were strange marks. Long, jagged lines that looked almost like claw marks. They were fresh, the wood splintered and raw. My heart raced as I looked around, but the woods were silent. I didn't wait to investigate further. I ran to my car, jumped in, and started the engine. The tires spun on the gravel as I sped away, the cabin shrinking behind me. The strange noises never made sense. I never saw what caused them, and I never returned to that cabin. But I know now that the woods hold secrets, not ghosts or monsters from stories, but real dangers hidden in the darkness. And sometimes the silence is the scariest sound of all.